Hello and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. In the early days of May 1883, on a stretch of empty, wind-scoured coastline in southwestern Africa, called Angra Pequena, a bay so dry and so thoroughly ignored by every European power that had ever glanced at a map of the continent that not one of them had bothered even to plant a flag there, a young clerk named Heinrich Vogelsang stepped off a chartered schooner carrying, in his own coat pocket, a contract written in careful, formal German and considerably less careful understanding, on the part of the man he was about to negotiate with, of exactly what that contract actually said. Vogelsang worked for a Bremen tobacco merchant named Adolf Lüderitz, a man who had never set foot in Africa himself, and who had sent his own agent ahead specifically to purchase, cheaply and quietly, and before any rival trading house or any rival government could intervene, a length of coastline and a stretch of the barren interior behind it, from a Nama captain named Joseph Fredericks II, the elected leader of a small community at a mission station called Bethany, who controlled, by the loose and largely informal territorial arrangements of the region, a claim to the land Lüderitz wanted. The two men reached an agreement, signed and witnessed and translated back and forth between German and the mixture of Dutch, English and Nama, that passed for the region's common commercial language, granting Lüderitz the coastal bay itself and a belt of territory extending, in the words both sides believed they had settled on, 20 miles inland from the shore, and it was in that single word, mile, translated with a precision that served one side's interests very much better than the other's, that this whole long night story actually begins, because the German text Vogelsang had prepared specified geographical miles, an old cartographic unit equal to roughly 4.5 English miles, while Fredericks, negotiating in a regional trade language where the word mile meant, as it had always meant to him and to every other trader working that coast, the ordinary English statute mile a British or Cape Colony merchant would have used, believed he had sold a strip of land some 20 miles wide and granted, without any real understanding that he had done so, a claim to territory closer to 90 miles wide instead, a discrepancy Lüderitz's own company would go on, within a matter of months, to insist on enforcing to the letter, and a discrepancy that handed a single Bremen merchant, acting entirely on his own private account with no German soldier, no German warship, and no German official anywhere within 1,000 miles to back him up, a foothold on the African continent nearly 5 times larger than the man who had sold it to him ever believed he was parting with. Tonight is not, at its own core, a story about a single contested word in a single contract signed on a single stretch of empty coastline. Though we will return to Angra Pequena properly, and to the man who bought it, before this night is very much older, because a paperwork dispute over the length of a mile is a very small thing to hang an entire colonial empire on, and this story is not, in the end, a story about one merchant's sharp dealing at all. It is a story about how a nation barely 13 years old at the moment Vogelsang stepped off that schooner, a nation that had spent the whole of the preceding 3 centuries as a patchwork of quarrelling kingdoms and free cities, with no overseas ambitions to speak of, came, within the space of a single generation, to rule territory scattered across 4 continents and 2 oceans, a scattered assemblage of desert and rainforest and coral atoll, and leased Chinese harbour, that at its own largest extent covered something in the range of 1 million square miles and held some 14 or 15 million subjects who had never asked to be ruled by Berlin, and who had, in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, no say whatsoever in the arrangement. This is a story about chartered trading companies handed the power of governments and asked to build an empire on credit, about missionary societies and colonial leagues, and nationalist newspapers back home selling a public that had never seen Africa or the Pacific or China on the idea that a place in the sun was a nation's birthright, about the specific and considerable violence, land seized, labour coerced, whole peoples driven into famine and, in at least one documented instance, systematically exterminated, that this same empire was actually built on, and about how completely and how quickly it was all taken away again in the space of barely 4 years of a single world war. by rivals who had, in nearly every case, built their own empires the very same way a full generation or two earlier and simply gotten there first. We are going to walk through this empire colony by colony tonight, the coastline bought by a mistranslated word, the two great swathes of Africa fought over and settled and in one case drenched in a genocide. This programme is not going to look away from the rebellion that spread, in ways no German administrator ever expected, across an entire Eastern African region uniting peoples who had never before considered themselves allies. The islands of the Pacific bought and bartered for like parcels of furniture, the least Chinese port built quite literally on the back of two murdered missionaries, and the long, brutal, largely forgotten campaign fought across 4 countries of Eastern Africa that only ended, of all the fronts of the entire First World War, after the armistice in Europe had already been signed. It is also worth naming exactly how strange this whole ambition actually looked from the outside at the moment it began, because Germany embarked on building this scattered global empire not from any position of obvious strength, but from a position of genuine anxiety. A young nation watching millions of its own citizens emigrate every decade to the United States and to South America in search of land and opportunity, a crowded and rapidly industrializing German homeland increasingly struggled to provide, and colonial advocates back in Berlin argued, with a conviction the actual colonies would go on to disappoint almost entirely, that German territory overseas might absorb at least some of that same emigrant wave, keeping German families, German language, and German loyalty within the formal boundaries of a German empire rather than losing them permanently to some other nation's own melting pot. I hope this evening's own later hours are going to show you failing almost completely, because German emigrants, given the actual choice between the harsh, disease-ridden, and economically marginal conditions of most of Germany's own colonial territories and the established, considerably more prosperous opportunities of the Americas, continued choosing the Americas in overwhelming numbers right through to the very end of the colonial empire's existence, leaving Germany's own overseas territories populated, in the end, by a comparatively tiny number of German settlers, soldiers and officials presiding over populations of colonized subjects that outnumbered them in every single one of Germany's African and Pacific colonies by ratios running into the hundreds or even thousands to one. Consider, too, exactly how few actual German settlers this whole enormous project ever attracted, because German Southwest Africa, the one colony German settlement planners regarded as genuinely suitable for European family farming thanks to its temperate highland climate, held, by 1913, only something in the range of 15,000 German settlers scattered across a territory considerably larger than the whole of Germany itself, while German East Africa, Cameroon and Togo combined held only a few thousand permanent German residents apiece, the overwhelming majority of them administrators, missionaries, soldiers, and plantation managers rather than the family farmers. Colonial recruitment literature had spent decades promising would follow, and the Kiautschou concession in China held, at its own peak, barely 2,000 Germans in a leased territory of several 100,000 Chinese residents, a settlement pattern that meant the empire colonial propaganda had sold to the German public as a genuine outlet for national emigration and national expansion, never, at any single point across its own 30-year existence, actually resembled anything like the settler colonies of British Canada, British Australia or Argentina, remaining instead, everywhere Germany claimed it, a thin administrative and commercial presence draped in official rhetoric back home, in considerably grander language than the numbers on the ground ever actually supported. It is this same enormous numerical imbalance, a small handful of German administrators ruling immense populations who vastly outnumbered them, that makes the specific mechanisms of control this whole night is going to walk you through: chartered companies, native law, forced labour, and, in the most extreme documented case, outright extermination, considerably more comprehensible as deliberate strategy rather than simple happenstance. Because an empire this thin on the ground had no realistic option of ruling through sheer force of numbers at all, and depended, everywhere it actually took root, on exactly the combination of local collaboration, economic coercion, and periodic, deliberately overwhelming violence that this whole night's story is about to walk you through colony by colony in the fullest detail the surviving record allows. Before we drift any further into tonight's long story, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find something worth returning to here, because that is truly the only reason I would ever want you to. This is still a small channel, sitting right around 1,000 subscribers as this particular story goes out into the world, and if you feel like giving a hand to a channel that means to keep telling these long, unhurried stories for a good while yet, helping us find our own way toward 10,000 subscribers would mean considerably more than you probably realise sitting there listening tonight. If you are watching this on YouTube, the Spotify link for this channel is waiting for you down in the description, since new episodes have taken to landing there a little before they reach this same screen. And if you happen to be listening on Spotify right now instead, all it takes is searching Historian at Midnight on YouTube to find the rest of what this channel has been quietly building in the meantime. And if the mood takes you, leave your own location and your own local time down in the comments below, because it costs nothing at all, and it lets other restless, sleepless people find their way to this same corner of the internet. And there really is something quietly pleasant about knowing that somewhere out there tonight, under some entirely different stretch of sky, a stranger is settling into their own version of this same slow, unhurried hour. You do not have to hold on to any of what follows to get something out of it, so go ahead and let your body sink a little further into whatever is currently underneath it. A bed or a couch or a chair, you never quite meant to still be sitting in this late, and if a lamp is throwing light anywhere in the room, let it dim, or let your own eyes lose their focus if the dark already found you first. Nothing in the hours ahead needs your full attention to make sense, only your ears, the way a distant train might pass through a sleeping town and register only as a low, steady vibration to someone who never gets up to check what it was. And if your mind wanders off part-way through some story of a river in Kamerun, or an island in the Pacific and comes back 20 minutes later somewhere else entirely, that is not a failure on your part. That is simply what a night like this one is actually built for. Let yourself drift, whenever your own body is ready to, into the story of an empire assembled out of desert and jungle and ocean by a chancellor who did not particularly want it, a Kaiser who wanted it rather more than he understood what it would cost, and millions of people on 4 separate continents who were never once consulted about any of it. A chancellor who kept his own map of Africa folded up inside Europe. To understand how a mistranslated contract on an empty stretch of southwest African coastline ever became a matter of German state policy at all, we have to begin, for a while, considerably further from Africa than Agrippa, in the private convictions of the one man who had actually built the German Empire itself, and who spent nearly the whole of the decade before Vogelsang's own voyage insisting, to anyone who would listen, that colonies overseas were the last thing that same empire actually needed. Otto von Bismarck had unified a scattering of German kingdoms and free cities into a single empire through 3 carefully calculated wars fought in barely 6 years, and he governed the new state that resulted from a position of authority no chancellor who came after him would ever quite match. An authority he used, across the 1870s and into the early 1880s, to keep German foreign policy fixed, almost obsessively, on the continent immediately around it, a France still nursing the wound of its own recent defeat, and its own lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, an Austria-Hungary whose influence over German affairs Bismarck's own wars had only just finished expelling, and a Russia whose friendship he considered worth almost any diplomatic contortion to preserve. Colonies, in Bismarck's own private and repeatedly stated assessment, offered a great deal of expense, a great deal of exposure to naval powers Germany could not yet hope to match, and almost nothing in the way of genuine strategic advantage, a judgment he is remembered to have delivered, with real bluntness, to an explorer who arrived at his own office, pressing new German territorial claims in Africa, telling the man, in substance if not in the exact remembered wording, that his own map of Africa lay here in Europe, that Russia sat to the east and France to the west and Germany squarely in the middle, and that this, and nothing more, was the whole of his own African policy. It is worth admitting honestly exactly what kept pushing against that same firm private conviction across those same years, because Bismarck's own resistance to colonial expansion did not go unchallenged inside Germany itself, and the pressure that eventually overcame it came from several directions at once rather than any single source. German missionary societies, considerably more active across Africa and the Pacific by the 1870s and 80s than most ordinary Germans back home fully appreciated, lobbied for state protection of the mission stations and mission converts their own societies had already established in places like Togo and German East Africa long before any German flag flew over either territory, arguing that German Christians labouring overseas deserved the same protection any other German subject abroad could expect. German trading houses, Luderitz's own firm chief among them, but joined by considerably larger and considerably better connected merchant interests in Hamburg and Bremen, who had spent decades building genuine commercial networks along the West African coast and across the Pacific trading in palm oil, copra and ivory, pressed for formal state backing that would let them compete on equal terms with the British and French merchants who already enjoyed their own government's naval and diplomatic protection. And a new and increasingly well-organised nationalist colonial lobby, gathering itself by the early 1880s into formal pressure groups like the German Colonial Society, argued, in pamphlets and newspaper columns that reached a considerably wider public than Bismarck's own private correspondence ever did, that a nation of Germany's own growing population and growing industrial weight had both the right and the practical need to secure overseas territory for German emigrants, German trade and German national prestige, a case that found, across the early 1880s, a genuinely receptive audience among a German public eager to see its own young empire measured against the older colonial powers on something other than purely European terms. Notice too the specific electoral calculation that finally tipped Bismarck's own private scepticism into a sudden and genuinely dramatic public reversal, because the actual timing of Germany's first colonial acquisitions lines up with a precision several historians have found difficult to read as coincidence, with the run-up to German parliamentary elections scheduled for the autumn of 1884. Bismarck locked in a running domestic political struggle against the liberal parties in the Reichstag, whose own growing strength he was determined to blunt, recognised in the swelling colonial enthusiasm of these same years a genuinely useful weapon, a popular and patriotic cause that let him appear, to a public whose approval he needed at the ballot box as the champion of German commercial ambition on a world stage, even while he continued in his own private correspondence to regard the actual territories now being claimed with something considerably closer to bureaucratic irritation than any real imperial enthusiasm. It was this same calculation, rather than any genuine change of heart about the underlying strategic value of colonies, that led Bismarck, across a span of barely 18 months beginning in the spring of 1884, to place first Luderitz's own private claim in southwest Africa, and then, in quick and deliberately public succession, German trading footholds in Togo, in Kamerun, and in East Africa, under the formal protection of the German crown, and it is worth stating plainly that Bismarck accomplished nearly the whole of this expansion at the lowest possible cost to the German treasury, by declining, in almost every single case, to send German officials or German soldiers to actually administer the new territories directly, preferring instead to grant colonial charters to the very private companies and private merchants who had lobbied him for protection in the first place, and letting those same companies bear the real expense and the real risk of governing an empire the Chancellor himself had just finished claiming with a great deal of public fanfare in the German nation's name. A consul's ink and 4 separate claims planted in the space of a single year. It is worth turning now to the specific man Bismarck actually sent to give this new colonial policy its own formal legal shape, because the acquisitions of 1884 did not happen through any single grand gesture, but through a rapid, almost improvised sequence of consular visits, each one deliberately timed to outrun a rival power's own competing interest in the same stretch of coastline. Gustav Nachtigall, a German physician and explorer who'd spent years travelling across the Sahara and Central Africa and had built, in the process, a reputation as one of the most experienced German observers of the continent then living, was dispatched by Bismarck in the spring of 1884 with the formal title of Imperial Commissioner and a set of instructions considerably broader than his own modest rank might have suggested, empowering him to negotiate protection treaties with local rulers along stretches of the West African coast, where German trading firms already maintained an active commercial presence. Nachtigall's own ship reached the West African coast at Togo in July of 1884, where he signed a formal protection treaty with a local ruler named Malapa III at the coastal town of Togoville, a treaty concluded by every surviving account with considerably more genuine mutual understanding than Vogelsang's own contract at Angra had managed, though one that nonetheless committed a stretch of West African coastline and its own inhabitants to a German protectorate none of them had any real opportunity to refuse, and within days of securing Togo, Nachtigall's ship moved further down the coast to the Kamerun estuary, where he negotiated a second protection treaty, this one considerably more contested from the very outset, with a group of local Douala chiefs who ruled the trading towns clustered along the Kamerun River, a treaty concluded in a detail this evening's own later hours are going to return to directly, mere days ahead of a British naval vessel that arrived at the very same estuary intending to negotiate a British protectorate over precisely the same stretch of coast, and that found, on arrival, a German flag already raised and a German treaty already signed. It is also worth noting exactly how differently the German claim over East Africa came about, because it depended not on a single official consul's careful diplomacy, but on the considerably more freelance and considerably more reckless initiative of a young adventurer named Karl Peters, a man whose own name would go on, within only a few years, to become a byword among the very Africans he claimed to have peacefully treated with for a violence and a brutality that shocked even some of his own German contemporaries. Peters, acting entirely without official government authorization and financed by a small private society, he had founded himself specifically to press German claims in East Africa before Bismarck's own government could be persuaded to act, travelled inland from the East African coast in the autumn of 1884 and negotiated over the following weeks a rapid series of so-called protection treaties with local chiefs across the mainland interior opposite the island of Zanzibar, documents written in German that a great many of the chiefs who marked or signed them, by the honest assessment of nearly every historian who has since examined the surviving texts, could not read and had translated to them in terms considerably more generous and considerably vaguer about the actual surrender of sovereignty involved than the documents themselves actually specified. Peters returned to Berlin in early 1885, carrying a stack of these same signed treaties, and presented them to Bismarck as evidence of a genuine German claim to a vast stretch of East African territory. And Bismarck, whatever his own private reservations about the considerably improvised nature of Peters' own methods, recognised in the completed treaties a useful fait accompli, and granted in February of 1885 an imperial charter to the newly formed German East Africa Company, empowering it to govern, tax and administer the territory Peters had claimed with almost exactly the same combination of state sanction and privately borne risk and expense that already defined the German protectorates in Togo, Cameroon and Southwest Africa alike. It is plain enough, finally, exactly how quickly this same scattered handful of consular visits and freelance treaty signings actually needed a formal international framework to make them stick, because Germany was not, in claiming any of these territories, the only European power racing to plant a flag on African soil during these same years, and the risk of open conflict between rival European claims, French explorers pushing inland from the Senegal coast, British trading companies already established along the Niger and the Gold Coast, Portuguese officials asserting centuries-old but increasingly threadbare claims along both African coasts, and King Leopold II of Belgium pursuing, through an elaborate private charitable front, his own personal claim to the entire Congo basin, had grown serious enough by late 1884 that Bismarck himself, alongside the French Foreign Ministry, proposed an international conference specifically to settle the rules by which Europe's various competing African claims would be recognised. A conference this evening's own next hour is going to walk you through in full, because it was there, in a set of drawing rooms in Berlin itself rather than anywhere in Africa, that the whole of the continent's colonial future was actually decided. 14 nations, a continent, and not one African voice invited to the table. Name this plainly: the specific gathering that came to be called the Berlin Conference, or the Congo Conference, because it convened in Bismarck's own official residence on the Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin in November of 1884, and continued through a series of formal sessions until its own concluding act was finally signed in February of 1885, bringing together delegates from 14 separate nations, including every major European power alongside the United States and the Ottoman Empire, to settle, through careful and deliberately unhurried diplomatic negotiation, the specific rules under which European claims to African territory would be recognised as legitimate by the other powers present, and it is also worth naming, with a bluntness the conference's own official proceedings never once acknowledged, that not a single African ruler, not a single African diplomat, and not a single African voice of any kind was present in that same room, or consulted at any point in the whole of the conference's proceedings, to offer so much as an opinion on how the continent their own peoples inhabited was about to be divided among governments thousands of miles away. Consider too the specific legal principle the conference actually settled on, because it proved, in the years that followed, considerably more consequential than any single territorial boundary the delegates drew on their own maps, a doctrine that came to be called effective occupation, holding that a European power could claim recognised sovereignty over African territory only by demonstrating that it maintained some genuine and continuing administrative or military presence there, rather than merely by asserting a historical or exploratory claim on paper, a rule that sounds, examined honestly from a distance of a century and more, like a reasonable enough standard for settling disputes between rival colonial claimants, but that functioned, in immediate practice, as a starting gun for exactly the kind of rapid, competitive, and frequently violent occupation of African territory that came to be called, in the decades since, the Scramble for Africa, because every European power represented in that same Berlin drawing room now understood, with real and pressing clarity, that a claim left merely on paper, a treaty signed by Nachtigall or by Peters, and then simply filed away in Berlin, would count for considerably less than a claim backed by soldiers, administrators, and trading posts actually built and actually garrisoned on the ground, an incentive structure that transformed the leisurely, gentlemanly pace of earlier European exploration into a genuine race, conducted across the following decade to physically occupy as much African territory as each power could manage before a rival power's own soldiers got there first. It is hard not to notice, too, exactly what the conference's own concluding act actually confirmed for Germany specifically, because Bismarck, hosting the conference in no small part to demonstrate Germany's own new standing as a great power capable of convening and presiding over exactly this kind of international gathering, secured, through the conference's formal recognition, German sovereignty over all 4 of the African protectorates. The consular missions of the preceding months had claimed Togo, Kamerun, German Southwest Africa, and German East Africa, giving the newly declared German Colonial Empire, within less than a year of its own first tentative claims, a legal standing among the other European powers that no single German consul's treaty or single company's charter could ever have provided on its own. Notice too the specific and genuinely striking irony Historians have long noted in Bismarck's own role at that same conference, because the same Chancellor, who had spent the better part of the preceding decade insisting, in his own private correspondence, that colonies offered Germany nothing but expense and exposure, and who continued, even as the conference proceeded, to regard the territories now being formally confirmed with real private scepticism, nonetheless presided, as the conference's own host and chief convener, over the single, most consequential formal division of African territory the modern world had yet produced, a division his own considered private judgment never fully endorsed, but that his own public political calculation and the momentum of the colonial lobby pressing him from every side had by that point made almost impossible to reverse. One further name belongs here too, exactly how narrowly the conference's own attention actually ran, because for all the sweeping language its own concluding act used about African trade and African navigation rights, the delegates gathered in Berlin spent a considerable share of their own working sessions arguing not over the specific territories Germany itself had just claimed, but over the status of the Congo Basin, where King Leopold II of Belgium had spent years assembling, through a private philanthropic association that disguised what was, in practice, a personal royal fiefdom, a claim to territory nearly 80 times the size of Belgium itself, a claim the conference ultimately recognised, under the fig leaf of free trade guarantees and vague humanitarian language, neither Leopold nor his own private administration in the Congo would go on to honour in any serious way as the Congo Free State, a decision that would produce within only a decade forced labour atrocities on a scale that made even Germany's own considerably violent colonial record in southwest Africa look, to a number of contemporary European observers examining both empires side by side, almost restrained by comparison. It is also worth noting that the conference's own formal proceedings, conducted over 3 full months of the Berlin winter, in a sequence of unhurried, socially cordial sessions that alternated with elaborate state dinners and evening receptions hosted by Bismarck himself, produced a document whose own careful diplomatic language, guaranteeing free navigation of the Congo and Niger rivers, prohibiting the slave trade in principle across all signatory territories, and establishing rules for notifying rival powers of new territorial claims, read, on paper, as a genuinely progressive piece of international law for its own era, and it is worth admitting honestly that not one of the 14 governments who signed that same document ever seriously intended, in the actual administration of the territories the conference confirmed to them, to be bound by its own more humanitarian provisions any further than each government's own separate colonial interests happened to find convenient. A coastline bought twice over, and the war a mistranslated mile eventually produced. It is worth returning now to the specific bay this evening's own opening scene has already carried you partway through, because the discrepancy over the length of a mile that Heinrich Vogelsang's contract quietly built into Adolf Luderitz's own claim did not stay a merely theoretical dispute for very long. Once German settlers, German colonial officials and German colonial courts arrived to actually enforce it, Luderitz's own private company, chronically undercapitalised and unable to actually develop or profitably exploit the enormous stretch of territory its own contract technically granted it, sold its claims within only a few years to a considerably larger and considerably better financed concern, the German Colonial Society for Southwest Africa, a chartered company that took up with real and sustained determination the task of actually settling German colonists on land the original Nama and Herero inhabitants had understood themselves, at the moment of signing, to have only partially and only temporarily ceded. Consider, too, exactly how this same colonisation actually proceeded on the ground across the 2 decades that followed, because it depended in a pattern that repeated itself with real consistency across nearly every part of the colony, on a combination of formal legal instruments and considerably less formal economic pressure working together to strip the Herero and Nama peoples of the land and cattle that had, for generations before any German ever set foot there, formed the entire material foundation of their own way of life. German colonial courts, established to adjudicate disputes between settlers and the African populations whose land those same settlers increasingly occupied, consistently favoured German claimants in land disputes, recognising German title to grazing land the Herero people in particular had used, under their own traditional and considerably more flexible system of communal land rights, for generations without any formal written deed ever having seemed necessary, while German trading houses and German banks extended credit to Herero cattle owners on terms that left a great many of them, within only a few years, hopelessly indebted, forced to surrender cattle, and in a considerable number of documented cases forced to surrender the very land their herds had grazed. As collateral for debts, a genuinely predatory system of colonial credit had made almost impossible to actually repay. It is impossible to miss, finally, exactly what a natural catastrophe arriving from entirely outside German colonial policy did to accelerate this same process of dispossession, because a devastating outbreak of rinderpest, a viral cattle disease that swept across a vast stretch of eastern and southern Africa in the middle 1890s, reached German southwest Africa in 1897, and killed, by some contemporary estimates, as much as 90% of the Herero people's entire cattle herd within the space of little more than a single year, an epidemic German colonial administrators had no meaningful hand in causing, but that left an already increasingly indebted and increasingly land-poor Herero population suddenly and catastrophically dependent on wage labour for German settlers, on credit from German traders, and on whatever remaining grazing land German land companies had not yet formally claimed, a combination of disease, debt and dispossession that left, by the first years of the new century, a genuine and rapidly worsening crisis simmering across the whole of the colony, one that a great many Herero and Nama leaders had already begun. In private councils, German administrators only partially understood the seriousness of. To discuss as a crisis, their own people could not simply continue absorbing indefinitely. It is worth naming, too, the specific German official who actually governed Southwest Africa across the 2 decades this same slow dispossession unfolded, because Theodor Leutwein, appointed governor of the colony in 1894, pursued a style of administration that a great many of his own hardline critics back in Germany regarded as dangerously indulgent toward the very African populations his own settlers were steadily displacing, a policy Leutwein himself described in his own later writings as one of divide and conciliate, playing rival Herero and Nama factions and rival chiefs against one another through a careful combination of small military demonstrations and genuine diplomatic accommodation, signing treaties that preserved, on paper at least, a considerable measure of local chiefly authority, and relying, wherever he judged it possible, on negotiation rather than outright force to keep the colony's own always precarious peace intact. Notice, too, exactly how thin the actual protection Leutwein's own diplomacy offered the Herero and Nama peoples against the underlying economic pressure of settler land and cattle seizure genuinely was, because Leutwein's own considerably more moderate reputation, deserved though it was by comparison with what followed him, did nothing to slow the same steady process of debt, dispossession, and rinderpest-driven collapse this evening as already described. And it is worth naming, honestly, that a great many Herero leaders who dealt with Leutwein directly came, by the opening years of the new century, to regard his own diplomacy as simply a more patient and more polite version of the identical underlying demand. More land, more labour, more cattle, that harsher settler voices were pressing for through considerably blunter means. It is hard not to notice, finally, exactly what happened to Leutwein's own career once the Herero uprising of 1904 actually broke out, because his own considerably more cautious military response to the rebellion's opening weeks, one that continued to hold open at least the theoretical possibility of a negotiated settlement, drew sharp criticism from settler organisations and from a colonial lobby back in Berlin who had, by that point, concluded that Leutwein's whole approach to native policy had been dangerously weak from the very outset, criticism that reached Kaiser Wilhelm himself and that led, within months of the uprising's beginning, to Leutwein being effectively sidelined and then formally replaced in his own military command by the very general Lothar von Trotha, whose own considerably more absolute approach to pacification this evening is about to show you the full and catastrophic consequences of a change of command that several historians examining the whole episode since have identified as the single clearest moment at which German colonial policy in southwest Africa deliberately chose extermination over any of the considerably less lethal alternatives that had, until that same decision, still remained genuinely available to it. It is worth naming too a specific and considerably distinct community within the colony whose own particular status under German rule this evening we'll return to again before the night is over, because the Rehoboth-Basters, a mixed Afrikaner and Khoikhoi people who had migrated north from the Cape Colony in the 1860s and settled around the town of Rehoboth under their own elected council and their own written constitution, negotiated, unlike the Herero and the Nama, a formal treaty of protection with the German colonial government in 1885 that recognised their own considerable internal self-government in exchange for military cooperation, a status the Basters maintained and in several documented instances actively defended by supplying their own mounted militia to German forces right through the Herero and Nama War this evening is about to describe in full, only to watch that same negotiated autonomy steadily eroded by German administrators in the years that followed, as more land came under direct settler control, a slow unravelling of a treaty relationship that had once seemed, to Basta leaders themselves, a genuinely workable alternative to the fate other African communities in the colony were suffering at the very same time. A war that began as a defence of grazing land and ended as an order to leave no one alive. It is worth naming, plainly, and without any softening, exactly what finally broke across German Southwest Africa in January of 1904, because the Herero people, led by a paramount chief named Samuel Maherero, who had watched his own people's land and cattle steadily disappear across 2 decades of exactly the dispossession this evening has just described, rose in a coordinated armed uprising against German colonial rule, attacking German farms and German trading posts across a wide stretch of the colony's central highlands, and killing, in the rebellion's opening days, more than 100 German settlers, the overwhelming majority of the men, in a manner Maherero himself, in a letter he sent at the uprising's outset to Hendrik Witbooi, the respected leader of the Nama people further south, framed explicitly as a war of desperate necessity rather than of simple aggression, urging Witboi's own people to set aside old rivalries between Herero and Nama and join a common African resistance against a colonial power both peoples had, by that point, come to recognise as an existential threat to either of their continued ways of life. It is also worth noting exactly what the German government's response to that same uprising actually looked like, once it moved beyond the colony's own initially outmatched and outnumbered garrison, because Berlin dispatched a considerably larger force under the command of a general named Lothar von Trotha, a veteran of Germany's own earlier colonial campaigns in East Africa, who arrived in southwest Africa in the summer of 1904, carrying, by his own later account, an essentially unrestricted mandate to crush the Herero uprising by whatever means he personally judged necessary, and who moved, across the following months, to concentrate a considerable portion of the Herero population and its remaining cattle and dependents at a place called Waterberg, where a decisive battle fought in early August of 1904 broke the main Herero fighting force and sent a great mass of Herero men, women and children fleeing eastward, away from German positions into the vast and genuinely waterless expanse of the Omaheki Desert beyond. It is worth naming, honestly, exactly what Trotha did once that same fleeing population had entered the desert, because rather than accepting the surrender, a defeated and starving population might, under the ordinary customs of even the era's own considerably permissive colonial warfare, have been allowed to offer, Trotha issued in early October of 1904, a formal proclamation, since preserved in German colonial archives and quoted by historians ever since, declaring that every Herero found within German territory, whether armed or unarmed, whether accompanied by cattle or without them, would be shot on sight, and that German soldiers would no longer accept the surrender of Herero women or children at all, but would instead drive them back toward the desert or, should they refuse to go, fire on them as well, an order that amounted in the plainest possible legal and moral terms to a formal decree of extermination, and that German patrols proceeded over the following weeks to enforce with real and systematic thoroughness, sealing off the handful of known waterholes scattered across the Omaheke's own vast interior, specifically to ensure that the tens of thousands of Herero men, women and children who had fled there had no path back to water, and no path forward to anywhere else, left to die of thirst and starvation in the sand rather than permitted to surrender. Consider, too, exactly what happened to those Herero and, before very long, Nama survivors who did manage to escape the desert, or who chose, from the very outset, to surrender rather than flee. Because German colonial authorities, even after formally rescinding Trotha's own extermination order under pressure from Berlin, in December of 1904, a rescission driven considerably more by international diplomatic embarrassment than by any genuine change of underlying policy, established a network of concentration camps, a term German colonial administrators of the period used themselves, without any of the softening later history would eventually wrap around the phrase, at locations including the colony's own capital at Windhoek, and most notoriously, a small wind-scoured island just off the coast called Shark Island, where interned Herero and, from 1905 onward, Nama prisoners as well, following a second uprising Hendrik Witboy's own people launched that same year once it became clear exactly what fate had befallen the Herero, were subjected to forced labour building the colony's own railways and harbour works, starvation rations that left prisoners dying at a rape camp. Administrators themselves recorded with a bureaucratic indifference historians have since found genuinely chilling to read, and in a detail this evening would ask you to sit with directly rather than pass over quickly, a documented programme under which the skulls and other remains of prisoners who died in the camps were cleaned, catalogued and shipped back to universities and scientific institutes in Germany, where researchers actively engaged in constructing a supposed scientific hierarchy of human races used them as specimens, a programme whose surviving remains German institutions would spend more than a full century afterwards slowly and only partially returning. It is plain enough finally exactly what the honest arithmetic of this entire campaign actually adds up to. Because modern historical demographers, working from German colonial census figures recorded both before the uprising began and after the camps were finally closed, estimate that somewhere between 60 and 80% of the entire Herero population, and something in the range of half of the entire Nama population, died as a direct result of German military action, forced desert flight and camp internment across these same few years, a proportion of an entire people destroyed that places this specific campaign, by simple and unforgiving arithmetic alone, among the most concentrated acts of colonial violence any European power inflicted anywhere on the African continent during the whole of its colonial partition, and that has led a great many historians, in the century and more since, to identify the Herero and Nama genocide as the first genocide of the 20th century, carried out using administrative methods, camp registration, forced labour, systematic starvation, and a formally documented extermination order that a later German government would go on, within living memory of some of the very officers who served in southwest Africa, to apply on a considerably larger scale, considerably closer to home. It is worth pausing for a moment on what the actual physical experience of the Omaheke flight and the Shark Island camps meant to the people who lived through either one of them, because the statistics this evening has already given you can flatten, without meaning to, exactly what those same months actually felt like on the ground. Survivors who gave testimony in the decades afterward, collected by missionaries, by colonial officials conducting their own later inquiries, and eventually by historians and by Herero and Nama community elders determined that the memory not be lost, described entire families walking for days through sand that held no shade and no standing water at all, mothers carrying children who had stopped crying because they no longer had the strength to, and the specific remembered sound of German patrols firing on anyone who approached the handful of waterholes the army had deliberately fenced and guarded, a sound survivors recalled needing no translation at all to understand. Notice too the specific and considerably colder cruelty of Shark Island itself, a low, wind-scoured strip of land connected to the mainland by only a narrow causeway, chosen by German administrators, by their own later admission, precisely because its isolation made escape effectively impossible, where prisoners already weakened by the desert crossing or by capture elsewhere in the colony were set to hard labour building the harbour works and the railway line that would, within only a few years, connect the colony's diamond fields to its own export ports. Fed on rations camp doctors themselves recorded as insufficient to sustain the labour being demanded of them, and housed in the open, with no real shelter from the same cold Atlantic wind and the same cold Atlantic fog that gave the whole colony its name, so that camp mortality records German administrators kept with a bureaucratic thoroughness. This evening has already asked you to notice show death rates, in the camp's worst months, running to several % of the entire remaining prisoner population in a single week. It is impossible to miss, finally, that a considerable number of the very missionaries whose own societies had, decades earlier, lobbied Bismarck for exactly the kind of state protection that eventually produced this whole colonial system, watched the camps and the desert flight unfold with a documented private horror, a great many of them recorded in letters home even as their own missionary societies, dependent on the colonial government's own continued goodwill for permission to keep operating at all, generally declined to protest the policy in public with anything like the same directness. A quiet complicity through silence this evening would ask you to hold alongside the more dramatic cruelty of the camps themselves, because an institution capable of documenting an atrocity privately, while saying nothing publicly against it, played its own part in allowing that same atrocity to continue for as long as it actually did, a century of silence, and the word that finally arrived in 2021. It is worth stating plainly exactly how long it actually took for any German government to acknowledge, in formal and unambiguous language, what had happened in its own former colony. Because for well over a century after the last camp at Shark Island closed, successive German governments declined to apply the specific legal term genocide to the Herero and Nama campaign at all, treating it, in official statements, as a regrettable but essentially unexceptional episode of colonial-era violence, rather than as the deliberate documented campaign of extermination the surviving German archives themselves plainly describe. It is also worth noting the specific and genuinely long negotiation that finally produced a change in that same official language, because representatives of the Namibian government and representatives of Herero and Nama community organisations, the latter frequently excluded from a formal negotiating process conducted for years, primarily between the German and Namibian national governments alone, pressed across more than half a decade of difficult and repeatedly stalled talks for both a formal German acknowledgement of genocide and a programme of concrete reparations to the descendant communities whose own land and whose own ancestors had been the campaign's specific targets. Negotiations that finally produced, in May of 2021, a joint declaration in which the German government formally used the word genocide for the first time and committed roughly 1.1 billion euros, structured deliberately as development aid rather than as reparations in the strict legal sense, specifically to avoid setting a precedent that might expose Germany to comparable claims from other former colonies, to infrastructure and development projects in the regions of Namibia, where Herero and Nama communities live today. It is hard not to notice, finally, exactly how unsatisfied a great many Herero and Nama community leaders and descendants remained even after that same declaration was formally signed, because a considerable number of them criticised both the amount of the settlement, which they argued fell well short of any genuine reckoning with the scale of the loss inflicted on their own ancestors, and the deliberately careful legal language distinguishing development aid from reparations, which they read, with real justification, as Germany continuing to avoid the full legal and moral weight of what its own colonial administration had actually done, a dispute that remains, as this programme reaches you tonight, genuinely unresolved in the eyes of a great many of the very descendants the 2021 agreement was supposedly meant to address. A present-day echo this evening would ask you to hold, alongside every other ledger. This whole long story is still going to open tonight, without ever quite managing to close. It is worth naming, too, a separate and considerably more adversarial legal effort, a number of Herero and Nama descendant organisations pursued alongside, and in genuine tension with, the government-to-government negotiations this evening has already described, because representatives of both communities filed a formal lawsuit against the German government in a United States federal court in New York in 2017, seeking direct legal standing and direct compensation, independent of whatever Berlin and Windhoek might eventually agree between themselves, a case German lawyers argued should be dismissed on the grounds that a foreign court held no jurisdiction over a sovereign government's own historical conduct, an argument the presiding American judge ultimately accepted in 2019, dismissing the case on jurisdictional grounds without ever ruling on the underlying merits of the genocide claim itself, a legal outcome that left the diplomatic channel between the two national governments as the only forum still open to Herero and Nama claims, considerably to the frustration of community representatives who had specifically sought a forum where their own voices, rather than their own governments, would be heard directly. Consider, too, exactly what German colonial administration in Southwest Africa actually did to the surviving Herero and Nama population once the camps themselves finally closed, because a set of formal ordinances issued between 1907 and 1908, in the immediate aftermath of the genocide, stripped Herero and Nama survivors of the legal right to own cattle, or land anywhere in the colony at all, required every African resident over the age of 7 to carry a numbered metal identification pass at all times, and obligated every adult African to remain under contract to a European employer, a legal architecture of movement passes, compulsory labour contracts, an outright land and property exclusion that historians examining the later history of neighbouring South Africa have long identified as a direct and traceable forerunner of the pass laws and the Land Act South African administrators would go on, once they assumed control of the territory after the First World War, to formalise into the fuller apartheid system, a system that continued, under South African rather than German administration, to govern the everyday movement and the everyday labour of Namibia's black population for the better part of another 8 decades after the last German colonial official had left. A parliament dissolved specifically because a chancellor wanted colonial spending approved without any further argument about it. It is also worth naming exactly what the financial and political cost of fighting this same war actually did to German domestic politics back home, because the campaign against the Herero and Nama, considerably more expensive and considerably more prolonged than German military planners had ever anticipated when it began, required repeated new appropriations from the Reichstag to keep German forces in the field, and by 1906 a coalition of Centre Party and Social Democratic deputies, the latter increasingly willing to use the colonial war's own mounting cost and mounting brutality as a direct line of attack against the whole of German colonial policy, had grown genuinely willing to obstruct further war funding, a resistance that came to a head in December of 1906 when the Reichstag rejected a colonial supplementary budget outright. Notice too exactly how Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow responded to that same rejection, because rather than negotiating a compromise with the very deputies who had just blocked his own colonial funding, Bülow dissolved the Reichstag entirely and called new elections for January of 1907. Elections German nationalist newspapers and German colonial lobby groups fought with a deliberately inflammatory rhetoric that framed a vote against colonial funding as a vote against German national honour itself. Elections that came to be remembered in the considerably less flattering nickname German political history has attached to them ever since, as the Hottentot election, a name drawn from the same outdated and pejorative colonial term for the Nama people that German settlers and German newspapers of the period used throughout their own coverage of the war without any apparent second thought. It is worth admitting honestly that this same election produced exactly the result Bülow had been hoping for. A considerable swing of parliamentary seats away from the Social Democrats and toward parties more reliably supportive of continued colonial funding, a victory colonial enthusiasts back in Germany celebrated as a genuine popular endorsement of the whole imperial project. But it is worth naming too that the election campaign itself had, for the first time in any genuinely public and genuinely national forum, forced the German public to confront, however briefly and however much the actual campaign rhetoric worked to obscure it behind appeals to patriotism, the specific financial and human cost of the war being fought in its own name in southwest Africa. A small number of social democratic and centre party voices, August Bebel prominent among them, having used their own Reichstag speeches in the years immediately preceding the election to describe, in terms considerably more direct than German colonial propaganda ever allowed into print, the actual brutality of Trotha's extermination order and the actual conditions inside the camps this evening has already described, speeches that reached, through newspaper coverage of the Reichstag's own proceedings, a German public that had, until that point, generally encountered its own colonial war only through the heroic and heavily sanitized dispatches its own nationalist press preferred to print. It is plain enough, finally, that this same brief and imperfect flash of domestic political accountability changed remarkably little about the actual conduct of German colonial policy in the years that immediately followed it, because the camps this evening has already described remained open for a further year after the election that had, in theory, been fought partly over their own existence, and it would take, in the end, not a domestic election, but a full century of gathering international pressure, culminating in the 2021 declaration this evening has already described, before any German government was willing to apply, in fully formal and fully public language, the specific legal term the Hottentot election's own bravest Reichstag critics had already been reaching for, in substance, if not in exact, legal wording, more than 100 years earlier. It is worth naming finally a small and rather bitter irony that closes this particular chapter of the story, because Adolf Lüderitz himself, the Bremen merchant whose own agents contracted Agrippa this whole night began with, never lived to see any of what his own purchase eventually produced, drowning in 1886, only 3 years after Vogelsang's negotiation, while exploring the mouth of the Orange River further south, in a small boat searching for the very diamonds that, by the strange working of historical timing, were not actually discovered in the colony's own sand until 1908. 4 years into the genocide and 2 full decades after the man who first claimed the territory had already died still believing it worthless, a fortune in gemstones sitting, unknown to Lüderitz himself and unknown to any of the Herero or Nama families who had once grazed cattle across the very dunes that hid them, in the ground the whole time. A company with a hangman's nickname and a coastline it never actually pacified. It is worth turning now to the second, and by simple territorial extent, the largest of Germany's African possessions, because German East Africa, the territory that would eventually become modern Tanzania, Rwanda and Burundi combined, began its own colonial existence under the same chartered company model that had briefly governed Southwest Africa, and under the direct control of the same freelance adventurer whose own treaty collecting expedition this evening has already introduced. Karl Peters, having secured his own imperial charter for the German East Africa Company in February of 1885, returned to the territory determined to actually enforce, through direct company administration the sweeping claims his own considerably dubious treaties had granted him on paper, and proceeded, across the following several years, to earn among the East African populations subjected to his own rule a reputation for a personal brutality that shocked even a good many of his own German contemporaries, a reputation reflected in the nickname Hanger Peters, or roughly Hanging Peters, that East African subjects and eventually German critics back home came to attach to him, earned through documented incidents of summary execution and public flogging that Peters himself, in his own later memoirs, described with an unapologetic and genuinely disturbing frankness that would eventually cost him his own official career once a German parliamentary investigation, convened years afterward in response to mounting public criticism, formally censured his own conduct and stripped him of the colonial commission he had once held. It is also worth noting exactly how completely the East African population actually resisted this same company rule from its very earliest days, because the German East Africa Company's own authority, resting on treaties a great many local rulers along the coast had never genuinely understood themselves to be signing away sovereignty through, provoked, within barely 3 years of the Charter's confirmation, a major coastal uprising led by an Arab and Swahili trader named Abushiri ibn Salim al-Harthi, who organised across the last months of 1888 a coordinated rebellion of coastal towns against company administrators who had begun with real and deliberately provocative haste, raising the German flag over towns whose Muslim populations had never consented to any such display, and imposing customs duties and administrative controls that struck directly at the established trading livelihoods of the coastal merchant class, a rebellion that spread rapidly enough along the coast and threatened the company's own tenuous authority seriously enough that the German East Africa Company found itself, within weeks, entirely unable to suppress the uprising using its own limited private resources at all. It is also worth noting exactly why the coastal Swahili and Arab trading elite Abushiri drew his own following from felt the company's own arrival so acutely, because this same elite had, for generations before any German company charter existed at all, built a genuinely sophisticated commercial and administrative culture along the East African coast, under the nominal authority of the Sultan of Zanzibar, a culture built on Islamic law, on long-established trading relationships stretching across the whole of the Indian Ocean world, and on a coastal aristocracy that considered itself, with real historical justification, considerably more cosmopolitan and considerably more commercially sophisticated than the German merchants and German company agents, now presuming to tax and regulate its own trade, so that the Abushiri revolt drew a genuinely broad coalition of coastal Muslims defending an existing social and commercial order against a company administration that had, in barely 3 years, managed to insult that same order's own religious and commercial sensibilities more thoroughly than a century of nominal Zanzibari overlordship ever had. It is impossible to miss, finally, exactly what this same company failure actually forced Berlin to do, because the Abushiri uprising, suppressed only after the German Imperial government dispatched regular naval and military forces under an officer named German von Bismarck in early 1889, a considerably more costly and considerably more direct state intervention than Bismarck's own original chartered company model had ever been designed to require, exposed with real clarity exactly how thin and how genuinely fragile the private company approach to colonial governance actually was once it met organised local resistance, and led directly, within only a couple of years, to the German state formally assuming direct administrative control over East Africa in 1891, stripping the German East Africa Company of most of its own governing authority while leaving it, in a pattern that would repeat itself across a good many of Germany's other colonial holdings as well, still holding a considerable share of the actual commercial land and plantation concessions the colony's economy would go on to depend on. One further name belongs here too, the specific and genuinely consequential diplomatic bargain that actually settled Germany's own final northern border in East Africa, because the coastal strip of the mainland opposite Zanzibar had, prior to German colonisation, remained under the nominal sovereignty of the Sultan of Zanzibar, an Arab ruler whose own trading empire had dominated the East African coast and its lucrative ivory and slave trade for the better part of a century before any German consul or German company ever arrived. And Karl Peter's own original treaties, and the German East Africa Company's subsequent expansion, had proceeded in practice by steadily pressuring the Sultan into leasing and eventually formally ceding his own mainland coastal holdings to German administration, a process the Sultan's own government, dependent on British as much as German goodwill to preserve what remained of its own independence, had only limited practical ability to resist. Consider too the specific and rather remarkable trade Germany and Britain struck in 1890, once both powers had finished settling their own respective claims along the East African coast, because Germany formally recognised a British protectorate over the island of Zanzibar itself, abandoning whatever residual German commercial and political influence remained there, in exchange for British recognition of a considerably enlarged German East African mainland territory, and, in the specific detail that gave this same agreement its own lasting popular name, British cession to Germany of the small North Sea island of Heligoland, a strategically useful naval outpost lying close enough to the German coast that German naval planners had wanted it for years, a bargain that let contemporary wits on both sides of the North Sea joke, not entirely without justice, that Germany had traded away an entire African sultanate's worth of commercial influence for a single small island barely a mile long, a trade that nonetheless suited both governments' own immediate strategic priorities well enough that neither one, in the years that followed, showed any serious inclination to regret it. It is hard not to notice, finally, that this same Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty, negotiated entirely between London and Berlin, without any Zanzibari or East African representative present at the table, a pattern this whole night has already shown you repeating, in only slightly different form, at the Berlin Conference itself, settled the formal colonial boundary of German East Africa in a manner that would go on to shape the modern political borders of Tanzania, Kenya and Uganda for the whole of the following century, a reminder worth holding alongside everything else this evening has already asked you to notice about the Berlin Conference's own absent African voices, that the actual lines separating modern East African nations from one another trace back, in no small part, to a single diplomatic trade conducted in exchange for a small North Sea island, most of the people whose own future national borders it was busy settling had never heard of and would never visit, a kingdom absorbed into an empire that never bothered to rename it. It is worth naming, briefly, the considerably less remembered western portion of German East Africa, because the territory Germany's colonial administration formally incorporated into the colony included the kingdoms of Rwanda and Burundi, two considerably older and considerably more centralised political systems than anything German administrators encountered along the East African coast, ruled by monarchs, the Mwami of Rwanda and the Mwami of Burundi respectively, whose own established royal courts, tax collection systems, and social hierarchies German colonial officials, arriving in the region only in the final years of the 19th century, and never establishing more than a small handful of actual administrative posts across either kingdom's own considerable territory, found it far cheaper and far more convenient simply to leave in place and govern through, rather than dismantle and replace with direct German administration of the kind imposed along the coast. Notice, too, exactly what this same policy of indirect rule actually meant for the ordinary populations of both kingdoms, because German administrators, working through and formally endorsing the existing royal hierarchy's own social distinctions between the ruling Tutsi minority and the considerably more numerous Hutu majority, a distinction German colonial ethnography, working from the same racial theorizing this evening, has already described shaping German attitudes elsewhere in the empire actively hardened into a more rigid and more explicitly racialized hierarchy than either kingdom's own pre-colonial social structure had previously enforced, formally favouring Tutsi elites for whatever limited administrative and educational opportunities German colonial rule extended to the local population at all, a colonial preference that Belgium's own Mandate administration would go on, after the First World War stripped Germany of the territory entirely, to entrench even further, and that a great many historians examining the origins of the catastrophic ethnic violence that would strike the same region across the following century have identified as one of its own genuinely deep and genuinely traceable roots. It is plain enough, finally, that German administrators governed both kingdoms with a garrison and an administrative staff numbering across the whole of German rule only a small handful of officials for a combined population running into the millions, a ratio of foreign administrators to colonised subjects considerably thinner even than the already thin administrative presence German rule maintained elsewhere in East Africa. A reminder this evening would ask you to hold plainly that this whole empire, spread as it was across 4 continents, rested everywhere on a genuinely small number of German officials relying on exactly the kind of local hierarchy, existing or newly invented, that let a comparatively tiny colonial administration actually govern populations many hundreds of times its own size, a colony run on sisal, coffee, and a tax that had to be paid in cash nobody actually had. It is worth naming, plainly, exactly how the East African colonial economy actually functioned once direct state administration replaced the discredited chartered company, because German colonial officials, determined to make the territory pay at least a portion of its own considerable administrative cost, encouraged the development of large plantation agriculture, sisal grown for rope and cordage, coffee grown in the cooler highland regions, and rubber tapped from wild vines in the colony's own forested interior, operations that depended, in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, on African labour recruited and very often coerced, from among a population that German administrators regarded, with real and explicitly stated racial condescension, as a labour resource to be efficiently extracted, rather than a population whose own welfare deserved any independent consideration. It is also worth noting the specific administrative mechanism German officials actually used to compel that same labour, because a hut tax, imposed on African households across the colony and payable only in German colonial currency, rather than in any of the traditional goods or livestock, a great many African households might otherwise have used to meet an obligation to the colonial state, left households with no independent source of cash income almost no option, but to send at least one member out to work for wages on a German plantation, in a German mine, or on one of the colony's own expanding railway construction projects, a system that functioned in practice, if not in its own official colonial legal language, as a deliberately engineered mechanism for converting an entire subsistence farming population into a captive wage labour force, and that fell, in a pattern German officials themselves documented without any apparent discomfort, with particular severity on regions of the colony whose own traditional economies had, prior to German rule, never depended on cash income at all. It is impossible to miss, finally, exactly how harsh the actual conditions of that same plantation and construction labour typically were, because German colonial regulations formally permitted corporal punishment, delivered with a specific instrument called the kiboko, a whip made of dried hippopotamus hide, against African labourers judged by their own German overseers to have underperformed or misbehaved, a punishment applied according to surviving colonial administrative records, and to the testimony a great many East African communities have carried forward through oral history across the generations since, with a frequency and a severity that went well beyond whatever narrow disciplinary purpose German colonial law formally claimed to authorise it for, a grievance that sat, by the opening years of the 20th century, alongside the hut tax, and alongside the forced cultivation quotas German administrators had begun imposing on cotton-growing districts specifically, as one of the several accumulating sources of resentment that would, within only a few more years, help ignite the single largest anti-colonial uprising German rule anywhere in Africa ever actually faced. Consider too the specific commercial scale this same plantation economy actually reached by the years just before the Maji Maji Rebellion, because German sisal plantations concentrated along the colony's own northeastern coastal plain around the town of Tanga expanded rapidly enough across the 1890s and into the new century that German East Africa had become by 1905 the single largest sisal-producing territory anywhere in the world. Its own fibre shipped back to German and other European rope and cordage manufacturers in quantities that made sisal, alongside the colony's smaller but still considerable coffee and rubber exports, the one genuinely profitable commercial enterprise anywhere in Germany's African empire, a profitability that depended, in almost direct proportion to its own commercial success, on an ever-expanding demand for exactly the kind of coerced and hut tax-driven labour this evening has already described, plantation owners and colonial administrators working, in practice, as close and mutually reinforcing partners in extracting that same labour from a population whose own traditional agricultural economy the whole hut tax system had been deliberately designed to make insufficient on its own. And it is worth admitting honestly that the specific districts where German sisal and cotton cultivation demanded the heaviest and most sustained labour extraction, the very districts whose own hut tax burden and whose own compulsory cultivation quotas had grown most severe by 1905, correspond, with a consistency historians examining the rebellion's own geography have found difficult to read as coincidence, to almost exactly the same districts where the Meiji-Maji rebellion's own blessed water first took hold and spread fastest. A correlation this evening would ask you to notice plainly, because it suggests that Kinjeketile's own spiritual movement, however genuinely religious in its own stated form, spread along channels of accumulated economic grievance that a purely spiritual account of the rebellion's origins would risk leaving out entirely. A prophet, a bottle of water, and the rebellion it accidentally started across an entire region. Name this plainly, the specific and genuinely remarkable uprising that came to be called the Maji-Maji Rebellion. Because unlike the Herero and Nama War fought in the very same years, far to the southwest, this uprising did not begin with a single ethnic group's own grievance against land seizure, but with a spiritual movement that spread, in the space of only a few months during 1905, across a strikingly broad and strikingly diverse stretch of southern German East Africa, uniting peoples, the Matumbi, the Ngoni, the Ngindo, and a considerable number of others besides, who had rarely if ever before considered themselves political allies against a shared enemy. The movement's origins trace to a spirit medium named Kinjekitile Ngwale, who claimed, at a shrine near the Rufiji River, to channel a snake spirit called Hongo, and who began distributing, to villagers travelling from increasingly distant districts to seek his own blessing, a substance he called maji, the Swahili word for water, mixed with millet seeds and castor oil, and blessed with a specific promise that any warrior who drank it and then went into battle against German colonial forces would find German bullets transformed, on striking his own body, into harmless water rather than deadly lead. Notice, too, exactly how quickly and exactly how far this same belief actually spread once word of Kinjeketile's blessed water began travelling along the region's own established trade and kinship networks, because the Meiji medicine reached, within a matter of weeks during the summer of 1905, communities scattered across an enormous stretch of southern German East Africa who shared little in the way of common language, common ethnic identity, or common political organisation prior to the rebellion, but who found, in the shared conviction that German rule could finally be resisted and defeated, a genuinely unprecedented basis for coordinated action, launching across July and August of 1905 a series of simultaneous attacks on German administrative posts, German-run cotton plantations, and the African colonial soldiers recruited from other parts of the territory and known as askaris, whom German administrators depended on to enforce colonial rule, across a territory too vast for German officers to garrison directly themselves. It is worth naming, honestly, exactly what happened once that same rebellion actually met German rifle fire in open combat, because the Meiji medicine's own central promise proved, with a brutal and rapid clarity that cost thousands of rebel fighters their lives in the rebellion's opening battles entirely false. German-trained Askari troops and German colonial forces armed with modern breech-loading rifles, inflicting catastrophic casualties on rebel forces who advanced, in a considerable number of documented engagements, with genuine and evidently sincere confidence that the blessed water protecting them would actually work. And it is also worth naming that the rebellion's own failure to win any of its major set-piece battles against German forces did not end the uprising quickly at all, because rebel forces, having learned within weeks that direct confrontation offered no realistic path to victory, shifted instead toward a considerably more dispersed and considerably more difficult to suppress guerrilla resistance, one that German colonial commanders, frustrated by their own inability to bring the rebellion to any decisive military conclusion, responded to with a deliberate scorched earth strategy that would go on over the following 2 years to kill vastly more people than the actual fighting itself ever had. It is also worth noting exactly what that same scorched earth strategy actually involved, because German forces, under the overall direction of the colony's own governor, adopted a policy of systematically destroying crops, granaries, and villages across the entire rebel-affected region, reasoning with a coldness the surviving German military correspondence records without any apparent hesitation, that a rebellion sustained by a population capable of feeding itself could be broken most efficiently by simply ensuring that population could no longer feed itself at all. A policy that produced, across 1906 and into 1907, a famine of catastrophic proportions across the affected districts, one that modern historians, working from the fragmentary population records available for the period, estimate killed somewhere in the range of 200,000 to 300,000 people, a toll that dwarfs the rebellion's own actual battlefield casualties many times over, and that stands, considered honestly alongside the Herero and Nerma campaign, fought at almost exactly the same moment on the opposite side of the continent, as further proof that the specific combination of scorched earth famine tactics and formally documented policies of population destruction this evening, as already described in Southwest Africa, was not a single aberration but something considerably closer to a recurring instrument of German colonial pacification. Wherever German colonial authority faced resistance, it could not otherwise suppress quickly enough to satisfy Berlin's own patience. It is worth naming plainly the specific governor whose own name belongs attached to this same policy, rather than left as an anonymous colonial office. Because Gustav Adolf Graf von Götzen, governor of German East Africa across the whole of the rebellion, personally approved and defended the scorched earth strategy in his own official reports back to Berlin, framing the resulting famine in language that echoes with real and uncomfortable precision the justifications Trotha offered in Southwest Africa at almost exactly the same moment, as a regrettable but militarily necessary consequence of pacifying a rebellious population rather than as a foreseeable and, in the event, entirely predictable act of mass starvation. And it is worth naming, too, that Götzen went on, once the rebellion was finally suppressed, to publish his own celebratory account of the campaign back in Germany, a book that presented the famine's own catastrophic human cost in the same bureaucratically bloodless terms his official wartime correspondence had already established, receiving, for his own service, continued advancement within the German colonial administration, rather than any of the criticism a small number of Reichstag deputies attempted, with only limited success, to direct at his own conduct of the war. It is hard not to notice, finally, exactly where the rebellion's own name actually came from, and exactly what a considerably chastened German colonial administration drew from the whole experience once the famine had finally run its course, because Maji-Maji, the rebellion's lasting name in both German colonial records and in the East African oral and written history that has carried its memory forward ever since, preserves, in its own simple repetition of the Swahili word for water, the specific and tragic irony at the heart of the entire uprising, a movement that began in a genuine and, for a moment, genuinely unifying conviction that spiritual protection could defeat German rifles, and that ended in a famine considerably more lethal than any battle the Meiji Medicine's own believers actually fought. And it is worth naming, too, that the scale of the rebellion and the scale of the suffering the German response to it produced did prompt a limited reform of the colony's own worst labour and taxation abuses. In the years that followed, reforms German colonial officials themselves justified, in language historians have since read with real scepticism, as a genuinely humane response to lessons learned, rather than as the considerably more plausible and considerably less flattering alternative, a pragmatic recognition that a colonial economy, which had just cost the lives of 250,000 or more of its own labouring population, could not easily sustain a second uprising on anything like the same scale without risking the entire colonial enterprise's own continued viability. It is worth naming, too, exactly how differently this same rebellion has come to be remembered on the two sides of the ocean it was fought across, because in Tanzania today, Kinjeketile Nwale and the Maji Maji rebellion he helped inspire occupy a genuinely central place in the nation's own founding historical memory. Celebrated in school curricula and in a dedicated national museum as an early and, in the country's own official telling, a genuinely unifying act of anti-colonial resistance, one that later Tanzanian political leaders, Julius Nyerere prominent among them, would go on to invoke explicitly as evidence that a shared Tanzanian national identity, uniting peoples who had never previously considered themselves politically connected, had genuine and deep historical roots reaching back considerably further than the country's own eventual mid-20th century independence movement. Consider, too, that this same rebellion remained, for the better part of a century, considerably less known in Germany itself than the Herero and Nema genocide this evening has already described in southwest Africa, a difference in public memory that reflects, at least in part, the simple fact that German southwest Africa eventually became the modern nation of Namibia, whose own post-independence government pursued a sustained and internationally visible diplomatic campaign for recognition and reparations, while Tanzania absorbed into a considerably larger set of post-colonial national narratives and pursuing its own reconciliation with German history through channels considerably less prominent in international media, has only in the past decade or so begun to see the Meiji Maji rebellion's own history discussed with comparable seriousness in German public debate. A discrepancy this evening would ask you to notice, because it says something honest about how unevenly the work of historical reckoning actually gets distributed, even between two atrocities committed by the very same colonial power within only a single year of one another. A river estuary claimed days ahead of a British warship, and the king who was hanged for refusing to move. It is worth returning now to the specific West African colony. This evening's own account of the 1884 consular expeditions is already introduced, because German Kamerun, secured by Gustav Nachtigall's own hurried treaty, with the Douala chiefs mere days before a rival British vessel arrived to claim the very same estuary, developed, across the following 3 decades, into a colony whose own economy depended considerably more directly than East Africa's plantation system on the extraction of wild rubber and palm oil from a rainforest interior that German colonial concessionaire companies granted enormous tracts of land by the colonial administration with almost no attention paid to the rights or the continued livelihood of the African communities already living on that same land, exploited through labour practices that a great many contemporary observers, German critics among them, found difficult to distinguish in their own brutality from the forced labour scandals that had, at almost exactly the same period, made King Leopold's own private rule over the neighbouring Congo Free State a matter of genuine international outrage. Notice too the specific concession company system that actually organised this same rubber extraction, because German colonial administrators, following a model several other European powers had already adopted across their own Central African territories, granted enormous tracts of the Cameroonian interior, in several individual cases running to tens of thousands of square miles apiece, to privately chartered concession companies with names like the South Cameroon Company, and the Gesellschaft Nordwest Kamerun, granting each company a monopoly over the rubber and ivory trade within its own territory, and, crucially, the formal legal authority to compel local populations to gather rubber on the company's own behalf, an arrangement that left African communities across huge stretches of the colony's interior facing production quotas, enforced through exactly the same combination of hostage-taking, corporal punishment, and outright killing that had already made the neighbouring Congo Free State's own identical concession system a matter of documented international scandal. It is worth stating plainly that a German parliamentary commission, dispatched to investigate mounting reports of abuse in the Cameroonian concession territories in the years just before the First World War, confirmed in its own official findings that company agents had indeed employed systematic violence, including the taking of women and children as hostages to compel village rubber quotas, and documented instances of flogging severe enough to kill, findings that produced a wave of genuinely critical press coverage back in Germany and a limited reform of the concession system's own worst legal excesses. But that left the underlying model of concession company rule largely intact right up until the war itself finally ended German administration of the colony altogether. It is plain enough, finally, that this same pattern, genuine parliamentary investigation, genuine and often sincere public outrage back in Germany, and yet remarkably limited actual reform on the ground, recurs across nearly every one of the specific colonial abuses this whole night has described. A domestic German public that proved capable, again and again, of genuine moral discomfort once abuses were exposed in its own newspapers, but that rarely translated that same discomfort into the kind of sustained structural change that might have actually altered how any of these colonies were governed for the ordinary people living under them. It is also worth noting the specific human cost of constructing the Nordbahn and Mittellandbahn railway lines German engineers built across Cameroon's own interior in the years before the First World War, because both projects depended on forced labour conscripted from villages along the surveyed route. Under quotas, colonial district officers were expected to fill regardless of the season or of the same village's own competing need for labour in their own fields, conditions of construction camp life, insufficient food, inadequate shelter, and disease, that colonial medical officers' own surviving reports describe producing mortality rates among conscripted labourers running, in the worst documented construction seasons, into the double-digit percentages of the workforce actually assigned. A human cost German colonial administrators weighed, in their own official correspondence, almost entirely against the railway's own commercial value in moving rubber and palm produce to the coast, rather than against the lives of the men actually laying the track. A governor recalled from his own colony after his own household became a Reichstag scandal. It is worth naming plainly the specific governor whose own personal conduct made Cameroon, for a brief but genuinely striking period, the single most publicly scandalous of all Germany's African colonies, because Jesko von Puttkamer, who governed Cameroon for over a decade beginning in 1895, was accused, in a formal Reichstag investigation opened in 1906, of maintaining a household of African women held in conditions of forced concubinage, of ordering floggings carried out with a severity and a frequency well beyond what even Cameroon's own permissive native law formally allowed, and of financial corruption involving colonial funds diverted to his own personal use. Charges a parliamentary commission substantiated in enough of their own particulars that Puttkamer was formally recalled from his post in 1907 and dismissed from German government service entirely. It is also worth noting exactly what the specific manner of Puttkamer's own downfall reveals about the limits of German colonial accountability more broadly, because it took the personal scandal of a single governor's own household, rather than the far larger and far more systematic violence of the concession company system operating across the very same colony at the very same time, to actually produce a formal parliamentary investigation and a genuine public consequence. A pattern that suggests German public attention proved considerably more reliably provoked by an individual official's personal excess, the kind of story a newspaper could print with a name and a face attached to it, than by the diffuse, bureaucratic and structurally embedded violence of an entire colonial economic system, a distinction this evening would ask you to hold alongside the Hottentot election. This same night has already described, because both episodes show a German public capable of real moral reaction once a scandal became personal and specific enough to actually capture its attention, while the underlying structures that made such scandals possible in the first place remained standing. Consider, too, exactly what happened to the specific Douala ruling family whose own ancestors had signed the original protection treaty with Nachtigal 3 decades earlier, because Rudolf Douala Mangabell, who had inherited the paramount chieftaincy of the Douala people, and who had, unusually for an African ruler under German colonial administration, received a formal education in Germany itself, and maintained, for years, cordial and even genuinely warm relations with a considerable number of German officials and German missionaries, found himself by the early 1910s confronting a German colonial plan to forcibly relocate the entire Douala population away from the increasingly valuable waterfront land their own ancestral towns occupied along the Kamerun estuary. Land German colonial planners wanted cleared for European settlement and for the expansion of the colony's own main port, a relocation scheme Douala Mangabell resisted through every legal and diplomatic channel formally available to him, petitioning the German Reichstag directly and organising among the Douala community and among sympathetic missionaries and journalists back in Germany itself, a genuinely sophisticated campaign of resistance that succeeded for a time in delaying the relocation. Name this plainly, exactly, how German colonial authorities finally responded to that same resistance, because rather than accepting Douala Mangabell's own persistent legal challenge, colonial officials accused him, once the outbreak of the First World War in the summer of 1914 gave them a convenient pretext, of secretly conspiring with the approaching British and French forces then invading the colony, a charge historians examining the surviving evidence since have generally judged to rest on considerably thinner grounds than the German military tribunal that tried him found necessary to establish, and had him executed by hanging in August of 1914, a killing that removed, at the very moment German colonial rule in Kamerun was itself only weeks away from military collapse, the one Douala leader whose own patient legal resistance had most effectively challenged German land policy from within the colonial system's own formal channels, and that Douala Mangabell's own descendants and the wider Cameroonian public have, in the century since, come to remember as one of the clearest individual symbols of exactly what resisting German colonial rule through entirely legal and entirely peaceful means could ultimately cost. It is worth naming, finally, that Rudolf Douala Mangabell's own descendants have continued, across the century since his execution, to press for a formal reckoning with his own case specifically, petitioning German authorities for a formal judicial rehabilitation, a legal reversal of the treason conviction. A great many historians and a considerable number of the Douala Mangabell family's own legal advocates regard as having rested on fabricated or at best deeply questionable evidence from the very outset, and while the German government has, in more recent years, acknowledged the case publicly as a genuine injustice, it has stopped short, as this evening reaches you tonight, of the formal legal rehabilitation the family has specifically requested. One further small and specific ledger, alongside the considerably larger reparations questions this evening, has already described in Namibia, that remains open rather than closed. A smaller colony sold to the German public as the one place its empire had gotten right. It is worth naming briefly the considerably smaller West African territory of Togo, because German colonial propaganda back home, eager for at least one example of colonial administration that could be held up as evidence of the empire's own supposedly civilizing benefits rather than its considerable costs, settled on Togo as its chosen showcase, a so-called model colony whose own comparatively modest size and comparatively limited German settler population made it, in practice, if not in the actual experience of its own African inhabitants, easier to present in German newspapers and colonial exhibitions as an orderly, profitable, and genuinely well-administered territory, rather than the considerably more chaotic and considerably more violent picture the Empire's larger African possessions generally offered. Notice, too, exactly what that same model colony's own actual administration depended on. Because Togo's railway network, its cotton cultivation schemes, and its modest but genuine export economy were built, in overwhelming and thoroughly documented part, on forced labour extracted from the colony's own African population under a system of compulsory labour obligations that German colonial law formally sanctioned, a system that fell with particular weight on communities living along the routes of the colony's own railway construction projects, and that colonial administrators justified in official correspondence using precisely the same language of necessary civilizational discipline that German officials elsewhere in Africa deployed to justify considerably more openly brutal practices. A reminder this evening would ask you to hold plainly that the model colony label Togo carried in German popular imagination reflected considerably more about what German audiences back home wanted to believe about their own empire's character than about the actual daily experience of the Togolese population living under it. It is also worth noting that German administrators in Togo imposed compulsory cotton cultivation quotas on farming households across a considerable share of the colony's own interior, a policy modelled with real and explicit reference in the colonial administration's own official correspondence on similar forced cultivation schemes already operating in German East Africa, requiring households to devote a fixed portion of their own land to cotton grown for export to German textile mills, regardless of whether that same land might otherwise have gone toward food crops the household actually needed to feed itself, a policy that produced, in several documented districts and in several recorded years, genuine local food shortages that colonial administrators back in Berlin, reading the same optimistic production statistics the colony's own governor regularly submitted to justify the model colony label, showed little apparent interest in investigating any further. It is impossible to miss, finally, that Togo's own comparatively favourable reputation persisted right up to the colony's own final months under German rule, a British and French invasion force, moving swiftly against a German garrison too small and too poorly equipped to mount any serious defence, forcing German administrators to surrender the entire territory within only a few weeks of the outbreak of the First World War in August of 1914, making Togo, whatever its own carefully cultivated reputation for orderly administration, the very first German colonial possession anywhere in the world to fall once the wider war German colonial policy had spent 3 decades quietly courting, finally and catastrophically arrived. An ocean full of islands bought, sold and bartered like parcels of furniture nobody had actually asked to move. It is worth turning now, and considerably further from Africa than any of this evening's story has yet carried you, to the scattering of Pacific territories that made Germany's own colonial empire genuinely global, rather than merely African, because German traders and German naval officers had, across the 1870s and 80s, established a genuine and growing commercial interest in the Pacific's own copra trade, coconut oil pressed and shipped back to European soap and margarine factories in quantities considerable enough to justify, by the middle 1880s, a formal German claim to the northeastern portion of the large island of New Guinea, a claim formalised in 1884 under the same protectorate model Bismarck's government was applying to its African possessions at almost exactly the same moment, and named, in a gesture of imperial self-regard that struck a good many contemporary observers as slightly absurd even at the time, Kaiser Wilhelm's land, alongside a neighbouring cluster of smaller islands claimed the same year and named the Bismarck Archipelago in the Chancellor's own honour. It is worth stating plainly that Kaiser Wilhelm's land itself was placed, in a pattern this whole night has already shown you recurring across nearly every one of Germany's African possessions as well, under the administration not of the German state directly but of a privately chartered concern, the New Guinea Company, granted, like Lüderitz's own original claim in southwest Africa, full governing authority over a territory whose own difficulty and whose own considerable disease burden the company's shareholders back in Berlin had, by every honest later account, badly underestimated when they first applied for the charter. It is also worth noting exactly how badly that same underestimation actually played out on the ground, because German settlers and German company administrators who arrived in New Guinea across the 1880s and 90s encountered a climate and a disease environment, malaria chief among them, that killed European administrators and plantation managers at a rate considerably higher than almost any other territory in the entire German Colonial Empire, forcing the New Guinea Company to rotate its own European staff with an urgency that left the territory's actual day-to-day administration perpetually understaffed and perpetually inconsistent, a burden that fell, in practice, most heavily on the New Guinea Company's own considerable reliance on indentured labourers recruited from other Pacific islands and from China to work the coconut and copra plantations. Its own commercial charter had been granted specifically to develop a recruitment system that depended, as this evening has already described more broadly, across the whole of Germany's Pacific holdings, on contracts a great many recruited labourers only partially understood, and conditions of confinement a considerable number of them never survived their own multi-year terms to see the end of. It is also worth naming that the New Guinea Company's own financial and administrative failures grew serious enough by the final years of the 1890s that the German government formally revoked its colonial charter in 1899 and assumed direct state administration of the territory, the same pattern this evening has already shown you playing out in East Africa a decade earlier. A private chartered company proving again and again across nearly every one of Germany's colonial territories simply too thinly resourced and too narrowly commercial in its own priorities to actually govern a colony once local resistance, disease, or simple administrative failure exposed the model's own underlying fragility. It is hard not to notice, finally, that the island of Bougainville, the largest and in later geopolitical terms, one of the single most consequential islands within the whole of German New Guinea's own territory, remained, throughout the entire period of German administration, almost entirely unadministered in any direct sense at all, German officials never establishing more than the barest token presence there, a neglect that left the island's own considerable population to continue governing its own affairs through traditional local structures. German colonial maps nonetheless continued to colour in as German territory for the whole of the empire's existence. One further reminder that a great deal of what this empire claimed on paper back in Berlin was never, in any meaningful practical sense, actually governed by Germany at all. Consider too exactly how the German Pacific Empire actually continued expanding across the following 15 years, because Germany, considerably less able to compete with Britain and France for the Pacific's larger and more strategically valuable island groups, pursued instead a policy of acquiring smaller and, from a purely commercial standpoint, considerably more marginal territories, securing formal protectorates over the Marshall Islands in 1885 and over the Solomon Islands' northern portion at almost the same time, and then, in a transaction this evening, would ask you to notice for its own genuinely striking casualness, purchasing outright in 1899 the Caroline Islands, the Mariana Islands, aside from the American-held territory of Guam, and the Palau Islands from Spain for a payment of some 17 million German gold marks, an acquisition Spain accepted only because its own recent and catastrophic defeat in the Spanish-American War had left it desperate for whatever revenue it could still extract from colonial possessions it no longer possessed the naval strength to defend, a purchase that handed Germany, in a single financial transaction, concluded almost entirely without reference to the wishes of the island's own inhabitants, formal sovereignty over hundreds of scattered Pacific atolls, whose populations first learned they were now German subjects only once German administrators actually arrived to inform them of the fact. One further name belongs here too, a considerably smaller but, in commercial terms genuinely significant addition to this same Pacific Empire, because Germany formally annexed the small coral island of Nauru in 1888, a territory whose own modest size, barely 8 square miles in total, gave little early indication of the considerable mineral wealth German colonial surveyors would eventually discover sitting beneath its own surface. Extensive deposits of phosphate rock, formed over millennia from the accumulated droppings of seabirds and prized. Once German and later international mining companies began extracting it in earnest in the years just before the First World War as an extraordinarily valuable natural fertilizer that agricultural markets across the industrialized world had grown increasingly dependent on. Notice too that German commercial exploitation of Nauru's phosphate deposits, conducted through a chartered company operating under terms that gave the island's own Nauruan population almost no meaningful share of the wealth being extracted from beneath their own homes, established a pattern of extraction that would go on under the considerably longer Australian, British and New Zealand joint mandate administration that took over the island after the First World War stripped it from Germany, to continue for decades afterward, phosphate mining eventually leaving large sections of the small island's own interior stripped down to bare, unusable coral rock, an environmental and economic legacy that Nauru's own government, once the island finally achieved independence in the 1960s, would spend decades afterward trying, with only partial success, to actually reckon with and be compensated for. It is plain enough, finally, that Nauru's own story, a tiny island whose considerable underlying wealth was identified, claimed, and exploited by a colonial power that never bothered to ask the island's own roughly 1,000 inhabitants for any meaningful say in the matter, distills, in genuinely miniature form, almost the entire pattern this whole night has already traced across Germany's considerably larger African and Pacific holdings alike. Foreign claim asserted first, local consent never genuinely sought, and the actual material wealth extracted flowing overwhelmingly outward, to shareholders and to markets thousands of miles from the island or the coastline or the rainforest where it was actually found. A road-building quota, a murdered district officer, and an island's own chiefs executed by firing squad on a Pacific beach. It is worth naming, plainly, the single most serious armed uprising German colonial rule anywhere in the Pacific ever actually faced, because on the island of Ponape in the German Caroline Islands, the Succas district's own local chiefs, angered by a German colonial road construction project that conscripted their own people into forced labour under conditions and under a level of physical punishment, several colonial officials themselves privately acknowledged had grown genuinely excessive, rose in armed rebellion in October of 1910, killing the German district officer directly responsible for enforcing the labour quota, along with several of his own subordinates. Consider, too, exactly how the German colonial government actually responded to this same uprising. Because rather than negotiating with the Succas chiefs, or investigating the specific labour grievances that had provoked the killing, Germany dispatched a naval gunboat from its own East Asia squadron based at Kiautschou. This evening has already described in full, alongside colonial troops drawn from German New Guinea, and spent several months in 1911 methodically reducing the rebellion through naval bombardment and ground assault, finally capturing the rebellion's surviving leaders and executing a considerable number of them by firing squad on the island's own beach in a public spectacle, deliberately staged by the German administration's own explicit reasoning, to impress on the wider Micronesian population exactly what armed resistance to German rule would cost. It is hard not to notice finally exactly what German administrators did with the wider Succas population once the immediate rebellion had been crushed, because colonial authorities forcibly exiled several hundred Succas men, women and children to other, considerably more distant islands within the German Pacific Empire, a collective punishment imposed on an entire community for the actions of its own armed rebels that separated families, uprooted an entire local population from its own ancestral land, and left the Socas district's own remaining population under a German administration considerably harsher and considerably more suspicious than it had been before the rebellion began, a small and, outside of Micronesia itself, still comparatively little-known episode that belongs, this evening would argue, in exactly the same conversation as the Herero and Nama genocide and the Maji-Maji famine, not because it approached either atrocity in its own raw scale, but because it shows the same underlying German colonial reflex, overwhelming and deliberately exemplary force in answer to any organised resistance, reproducing itself with real consistency on a small Pacific island barely anyone outside the region has ever heard of. It is worth naming too exactly how German Samoa, the single most populous and, in German colonial planning, the single most prized of all its Pacific possessions, actually came under German rule, because Samoa had been the subject, across the 1880s and into the 1890s, of a genuinely tense three-way rivalry between German, American and British. Commercial and naval interests, a rivalry that produced, at one especially fraught moment in 1889, a standoff between rival German and American warships anchored in Apia harbour that a sudden and violent cyclone resolved rather more decisively than either navy's own guns ever managed to, wrecking nearly every warship present and forcing all three powers toward a considerably more cooperative arrangement. And that finally resolved itself in 1900 in a formal tripartite agreement under which the United States took the eastern portion of the Samoan Islands, centred on the harbour at Pago Pago, while Germany secured formal control over the larger western portion, centred on the island of Upolu and its own capital at Apia, Britain accepting, in exchange for withdrawing its own competing claim, German and American recognition of British interests elsewhere in the Pacific instead. It's also worth noting the specific style of colonial governance the man Germany actually sent to administer Samoa chose to adopt, because Wilhelm Solf, appointed governor of German Samoa in 1900, and holding that same post for the better part of the following decade, pursued a considerably more paternalistic and considerably more deliberately preservationist approach to colonial rule than nearly any other German administrator anywhere else in the empire, working actively, through formal decree, to limit the alienation of Samoan land to European settlers, to preserve rather than dismantle traditional Samoan chiefly authority alongside German colonial administration, and to restrict the recruitment of considerably more heavily exploited Melanesian and Chinese contract labourers, brought in under agreements that a great many labour historians since have identified as functionally indistinguishable from indentured servitude, to work the colony's own copra and cocoa plantations, specifically so that ethnic Samoans themselves would be spared the harshest forms of plantation labour other German Pacific territories imposed on their own indigenous populations, a policy that earned Solf, among Samoans themselves and among later historians examining German colonial administration comparatively, a reputation as one of the empire's genuinely more humane governors, even as the same policy depended for its own success on displacing the very worst of the colony's labour exploitation onto imported foreign workers who enjoyed no comparable protection at all. It is worth naming too a stark epilogue to Solf's own comparatively gentler administration, because when a New Zealand troopship carrying the influenza that would become the 1918 pandemic docked at Apia only weeks after New Zealand forces had taken the colony over from Germany, New Zealand's own military administrator declined to quarantine the ship despite explicit warning from the ship's own captain, and the resulting outbreak killed something in the range of 1 in every 5 Samoans within a matter of weeks, a catastrophe that had nothing directly to do with German rule at all, since Germany had already lost the colony by the time it happened, but that Samoans themselves, in the decades of political organising against colonial administration that followed, came to cite repeatedly as proof that whatever paternalist protections Solf's own German administration had extended, protections New Zealand's own considerably less careful administration did not feel bound to continue, had been worth considerably more than colonial apologists of any nationality like to admit once they were actually taken away. It is impossible to miss, finally, exactly what the darker side of this same Pacific Empire actually looked like beyond Samoa's own comparatively gentler administration, because the labour recruitment practices that supplied plantation workers to Germany's other Pacific holdings, and to a considerable number of Australian, British and French Pacific plantations operating on the very same model, depended on a recruitment system contemporaries came to call blackbirding, in which island populations across Melanesia were induced, through a combination of genuine wage offers and, in a great many well-documented cases, outright deception, coercion and kidnapping, to sign multi-year labour contracts binding them to plantation work, often hundreds of miles from their own home islands, under conditions of confinement and physical punishment that left mortality rates among recruited labourers running consistently and considerably higher than among the free island populations they were drawn from. A practice German colonial administrators in New Guinea and the Bismarck archipelago participated in and profited from every bit as fully as their British, French and Australian counterparts did, and that combined across the whole of the German Pacific Empire, with introduced diseases against which island populations possessed no prior immunity at all, to produce a documented and in several island groups genuinely severe demographic collapse across the very decades German colonial administration claimed in its own official reports back to Berlin to be bringing order and civilization to a previously unregulated Pacific world. A leased harbour bought with the blood of 2 murdered missionaries. It is worth turning now to the single most distinctive and, in the eyes of Germany's own rival powers at the time, single most provocative of all its overseas possessions, because the German concession at Kiautschou Bay on China's Shandong Peninsula did not begin with a chartered company's treaty or a consul's careful negotiation at all, but with a specific act of deliberate and calculated opportunism seized on the strength of a genuinely tragic and, in its own immediate details, largely unrelated local crime. In November of 1897, 2 German Catholic missionaries belonging to the Society of the Divine Word, Richard Henley and Franz Xaver Nies, were murdered by a group of armed men during a raid on the mission compound, where they were staying in Jai County, in the interior of Shandong Province, an attack whose own actual motives, rooted in local land disputes and in the considerable resentment a great many Chinese communities across Shandong had already developed toward the growing presence of foreign missionaries and the legal privileges those missionaries enjoyed under China's own unequal treaty arrangements with the Western powers, had, in truth, very little to do with Germany specifically at all. Consider, too, exactly how quickly and exactly how deliberately the German government seized on that same murder as a pretext for action. It had, in fact, already been quietly planning for some time, because Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had for years pressed his own naval advisers to identify a suitable Chinese port that could serve as a German coaling station and naval base to support German commercial and strategic interests in East Asia, had already, before news of the missionaries' murder even reached Berlin, settled privately on Kiautschou Bay as his own preferred target, and responded to word of the killings not with diplomatic protest alone, but with immediate and explicit orders to the German East Asia Squadron to occupy the bay by force, framing the coming seizure in his own private correspondence with his cousin Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, as a justified response to Chinese violence against German nationals rather than as the opportunistic land grab a great many contemporary diplomats and a great many historians since have recognised it plainly to be. It is worth naming plainly exactly how that same seizure actually unfolded on the ground, because a German naval squadron under Vice Admiral Otto von Bismarck sailed into Kiautschou Bay in the middle of November of 1897 and landed German marines who occupied the Chinese fortifications and the small Chinese garrison, stationed there without encountering any serious armed resistance at all. The local Chinese commander, given no clear instructions from a Qing Imperial government in Beijing, still working out how seriously to take a demand it had received only days earlier, choosing to withdraw rather than risk a confrontation with a considerably better armed foreign force, so that Germany secured, within the space of barely a week, and at the cost of not a single German or Chinese life lost in the actual occupation itself, formal control over one of the finest natural deep-water harbours on the entire Chinese coast, a control the Qing government, in a treaty signed under considerable diplomatic pressure only months later, in March of 1898, formalised into a 99-year lease granting Germany full administrative and military authority over the bay and a surrounding zone of territory, alongside considerable additional railway and mining concessions across the whole of Shandong province besides. Notice, too, exactly what Germany actually built at Kiautschou once the lease had been secured, because German colonial administrators, treating the port that grew up around the small fishing village of Qingtao as a genuine showcase of German engineering and German municipal planning rather than merely another extractive colonial holding, invested over the following 16 years in a genuinely substantial programme of infrastructure development, paved streets, a modern sewage system, European-style civic architecture, and a functioning German language school system that together made Qingtao, by the years just before the First World War, one of the most thoroughly and most deliberately Europeanised cities anywhere in China, and it is also worth naming, a considerably more famous and considerably more lasting legacy of that same colonial investment, because German brewers who settled in Qingtao founded in 1903 a brewery built specifically to supply European-style beer to the growing German colonial population and to the wider expatriate community across German and British interests in East Asia, a brewery whose own beer, sold under the name Tsingtao, remains to this day one of the best-known and most widely exported Chinese beer brands anywhere in the world, a genuinely strange and genuinely lasting piece of German colonial infrastructure that has long since outlived, by well over a century now, every other trace of the empire that originally built it. It is also worth noting exactly how directly Germany's own military contribution to crushing the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 connected back to the very colony this evening has just described building, because the German East Asia Squadron based at Kiautschou provided a considerable share of the naval and marine forces that formed the international relief expedition dispatched to break the siege of the foreign legations in Beijing, and German troops who served in that same campaign returned, in a considerable number of documented cases, to garrison duty in Kiautschou itself once the rebellion had been suppressed, carrying with them a reputation among the wider Chinese population, earned in no small part by the Kaiser's own Bremerhaven speech. This evening is about to describe in full, for a particular harshness that Chinese communities living under German administration in Shandong province had every reason to regard with genuine apprehension, and it is worth naming too a final and rather dramatic postscript to this same East Asia Squadron, because when the First World War broke out, the light cruiser Emden, detached from the squadron's own main body before the Japanese siege of Kiautschou began, spent nearly 3 months raiding Allied merchant shipping and shelling oil storage facilities across the Indian Ocean, sinking or capturing some 30 Allied vessels and briefly severing a British-owned undersea telegraph cable station on the Cocos Islands, before finally being run aground and destroyed by an Australian warship in November of 1914, a single ship's own brief and genuinely remarkable campaign that depended in no small part on exactly the network of German coaling stations and colonial ports this whole night has already walked you through, without which a German cruiser operating so far from home could never have kept the sea for anywhere near as long as the Emden actually managed to, and it is worth naming too that Germany's own share of the enormous financial indemnity the victorious powers imposed on the Qing government, once the Boxer Rebellion was suppressed, helped further entrench German commercial and administrative confidence at Kiautschou specifically, German negotiators treating the indemnity payments, alongside the railway and mining concessions across Shandong, that Germany had already secured in 1898, as further proof that the leased territory's own future was considerably more secure than the 99-year term of its own lease might otherwise have suggested. It is also worth naming exactly how the German colonial administration in Kiautschou attempted, in the years that followed the Boxer Rebellion, to distinguish its own governance from that same harsh military reputation, establishing a German-Chinese college in Tsingtao that offered a genuinely bilingual education combining German language and technical instruction with traditional Chinese classical curriculum, an institution that drew, across its own relatively brief existence, several hundred Chinese students from across Shandong and beyond, and that German colonial administrators held up, in their own official reports back to Berlin, as concrete evidence of the same civilizing partnership German colonial rhetoric claimed to be extending across the whole of its empire, even as the college's own actual student body remained a small fraction of the school-age population within the leased territory, and even as the formal legal and administrative structure of German rule over Kiautschou continued to exclude Chinese residents from any genuine voice in how their own city and their own surrounding countryside were actually governed. It is hard not to notice, finally, that this same combination, genuine infrastructure investment and a genuinely functioning school, alongside an entirely one-sided colonial legal and political structure, recurs in only slightly different proportions across nearly every one of the colonies. This whole night has already carried you through a pattern that reflects, considered honestly across the whole of this empire, rather than in any single territory alone, exactly the kind of both-hands truth this evening asked you, earlier tonight, to hold about the empire as a whole, genuine development offered with one hand while genuine political voice was withheld, just as completely with the other. It is plain enough, finally, exactly how briefly German rule over Kiautschou actually persisted once wider international events caught up with it, because the concession German gunboat diplomacy had secured on the strength of 2 murdered missionaries in 1897 fell, within barely 2 months of the outbreak of the First World War, to a combined Japanese and British siege that captured Tsingtao in November of 1914, ending German rule over the territory permanently and handing effective control in a transfer of colonial power that would go on to produce genuine diplomatic controversy at the peace conference. This evening's own later hours are going to describe in full, to Japan instead, a Chinese population that had endured 17 years of German colonial rule, finding itself, almost without any interruption at all, simply transferred to the rule of a different foreign power entirely. It is worth naming too exactly how Germany's own seizure of Kiautschou registered among Chinese reformers and Chinese nationalists at the time, considerably beyond the specific fate of Shandong province itself, because the speed and the ease with which a single German naval squadron had extracted a 99-year lease and a set of sweeping railway and mining concessions from a Qing government powerless to resist confirmed for a rapidly growing number of Chinese intellectuals watching foreign powers carve out one coastal concession after another across these same years. Russia at Port Arthur, Britain at Weihaiwei, France in the south, a genuine and widely shared fear that China itself was being sliced apart the way a melon is sliced apart, a phrase that entered Chinese political language during precisely this period and that fed directly into the brief and ultimately crushed program of institutional reform the Guangxu Emperor attempted in 1898, and, in the considerably longer run, into the revolutionary nationalist sentiment that would eventually topple the Qing dynasty itself, barely a decade into the new century. A chain of consequence this evening would ask you to notice, because a single German naval landing at a small fishing village most Germans back home could not have located on a map helped, in its own small but genuinely traceable way, accelerate the end of China's own last imperial dynasty. Consider, too, exactly what actually built the harbour works, the railway line, and the paved streets this evening has already described making Tsingtao into Germany's own colonial showcase, because the manual labour for nearly all of it was supplied by Chinese workers recruited from across Shandong province, under contracts that paid considerably less than comparable German labour would have commanded, and that offered no meaningful legal protection against the long hours and the physically dangerous conditions harbour and railway construction generally involved. A workforce whose own individual names survive in the overwhelming majority of cases, nowhere in the German colonial record at all, counted only in the aggregate labour statistics German engineers submitted to justify their own construction budgets back to Berlin. One further instance of the same asymmetry this whole night has already asked you to notice in whose lives an empire's own paperwork actually bothered to record. A Kaiser's speech about Huns, and the colonies pressed into service, crushing a rebellion that was not their own. It is worth naming, briefly, a considerably less remembered episode that connects Germany's own overseas empire directly to one of the most consequential upheavals in modern Chinese history, because when the Boxer Rebellion, an uprising by Chinese peasants and militia members against foreign influence and against Chinese Christian converts alike, spread across northern China in 1900 and threatened foreign legations in Beijing itself, Germany contributed a substantial expeditionary force to the international coalition, assembled to suppress the rebellion and relieve the besieged legations, and Kaiser Wilhelm, addressing German troops departing for China in a speech delivered at the port of Bremerhaven in July of 1900, urged them, in language his own government would spend the following decades trying, with only limited success, to live down, to give the Chinese no quarter and take no prisoners, comparing German soldiers explicitly to the Huns of ancient legend, and expressing the hope that the very name German would come to inspire, among the Chinese population for 1,000 years to come, the same terror the Huns had once inspired across Europe. A speech that a great many of Germany's own rivals, and a great many later historians as well, would go on to cite as genuine evidence of an underlying brutality in German colonial and military thinking that the Second World War would eventually reveal on a considerably larger and considerably more catastrophic scale. A postcard rack, a school textbook, and a travelling exhibit that sold an Empire 9 in every 10 Germans would never actually see. Name this plainly, exactly how this whole scattered empire was actually sold to an ordinary German public that had, in the overwhelming majority of cases, never travelled to a single one of the territories flying its own flag, because the German colonial society, alongside a considerable number of smaller regional colonial leagues and women's colonial auxiliary organisations, published magazines, distributed illustrated postcards depicting colonial soldiers, colonial landscapes, and colonial subjects posed according to a carefully curated set of racial and civilizational categories, and funded travelling exhibitions that brought colonial artefacts, and in the case of the Völkerschauen, this evening is about to describe colonised people themselves into German towns that would otherwise have had no direct contact with the empire at all. Consider too the specific and enormous public spectacle Germany staged in the summer of 1896, when the first German colonial exhibition opened in Berlin's own Treptower Park as part of a wider industrial and trade exposition, featuring, alongside pavilions displaying colonial produce and colonial trade statistics, a living exhibit of more than 100 men, women and children brought from German East Africa, Cameroon, Togo and New Guinea specifically to be viewed over the course of the exhibition's several months by German visitors who came, in numbers reported at the time to run into the hundreds of thousands, to look at colonised human beings housed in constructed village settings as though they were, themselves, simply another category of colonial exhibit alongside the coffee, the rubber and the sisal fibre displayed in the pavilions nearby. An event German organisers presented without any apparent discomfort in their own official programme notes, as a genuinely educational opportunity for ordinary Germans to encounter the Empire's own subject peoples first-hand. Notice too exactly how deeply this same colonial imagery penetrated German schoolrooms specifically, because colonial geography and colonial history entered German school curricula across the 1890s and into the new century as a genuinely standard subject. Textbooks presenting German rule over Africa and the Pacific in language of civilizational duty and national achievement that left generations of German schoolchildren, this evening would ask you to notice, absorbing a picture of the empire considerably more heroic and considerably more benevolent than the actual administrative record this whole night has walked you through, a curriculum that's shaped, in ways historians have traced directly into the following century's own political culture, an entire generation's basic assumptions about German national identity and Germany's own supposedly rightful place among the world's great colonial powers. It is impossible to miss, finally, that this same propaganda effort succeeded, by any honest measure, considerably better at shaping German domestic opinion than the empire itself ever succeeded at actually turning a profit, because German public enthusiasm for its own colonial project remained, right up to the outbreak of the First World War, considerably higher than the empire's own genuinely modest economic returns would, on their own, have ever justified. A gap between perception and reality this evening has already asked you to notice once, in the specific financial ledger of colonial subsidy. And that shows up here again, in the simple fact that an empire losing money in almost every year of its own existence nonetheless commanded, from the ordinary German public whose own taxes quietly covered that loss, a genuine and widespread pride that its own balance sheet never once actually earned. It is worth naming, too, a considerably smaller and considerably more collectible piece of this same propaganda effort, because the German Colonial Post Office issued its own distinct series of postage stamps for every one of its African, Pacific and Chinese territories. Ordinary German stamp designs simply overprinted with the name of whichever colony the stamp was destined for: Deutsch Ostafrika, Kamerun, Togo, Kiautschou, and the rest. Small printed rectangles of paper that circulated through the German colonial postal system carrying, on their own surface, exactly the same assertion of settled and legitimate sovereignty that this whole night's opening contract at Angra Pequena had once tried to establish through a single disputed word, a habit of German stamp collectors back home eagerly assembling complete sets of every colonial overprint that turned the empire's own scattered and often barely governed territories into a genuinely popular hobby, one further quiet way an empire built, in no small part, on paperwork and disputed language kept, reasserting its own claim to legitimacy through paperwork alone, one small printed rectangle at a time, both hands held open at once on what this empire actually built alongside what it destroyed. Before this evening carries you any further into how the whole of this scattered empire eventually collapsed, it is owed to you, honestly, to hold both hands open at once on exactly what German colonial rule actually left behind, because a story that dwelt only on land seizure, forced labour, and the specific and genuinely documented genocide this programme has already described in Southwest Africa would not, in its own way, be telling you the complete truth of this empire either, and a fair accounting demands room for both. German colonial administrations did build genuine infrastructure across a great many of their territories, railways connecting interior plantations to coastal ports, harbour works and municipal water systems in cities like Qingdao and Dar es Salaam, and a network of mission and government schools that provided to at least a limited number of African, Pacific and Chinese subjects, an education in literacy and in European languages that a considerable number of the very individuals who would go on to lead anti-colonial and independence movements across the following half-century in territories German colonial rule had touched, and in a great many others besides, would later credit with having given them their own first genuine tools for organising resistance to colonial rule of any kind at all. It is also worth noting, though, exactly how completely that same infrastructure was designed, from its very first survey and its very first blueprint, to serve German commercial and administrative interests rather than the welfare of the populations it nominally served, because the railways German engineers built across East Africa and Cameroon ran, with almost no exception, from productive interior regions directly to coastal ports built for export, rather than connecting African communities to one another in any pattern that might have served their own internal trade or their own internal development. A design logic that reflected, with real honesty once examined plainly, the fundamental purpose every one of these colonial infrastructure projects actually served: extracting raw material and agricultural produce from African, Pacific and Chinese land as efficiently as possible for the benefit of German industry and German consumers back home. A purpose that the genuine, if limited, educational and medical benefits a comparatively small number of colonial subjects did receive never came close to offsetting against the land lost, the labour coerced, and, in Southwest Africa specifically, the lives deliberately and systematically destroyed. It is worth naming, finally and with real honesty, exactly how this same empire actually performed on the one measure its own original architects in Berlin had most consistently promised the German public it would deliver, because German colonial policy had been sold, from Bismarck's own initial and reluctant reversal, through Bülow's own later rhetoric about a place in the sun, on the explicit promise that overseas colonies would ultimately pay their own way, generating trade, absorbing German emigrants who might otherwise settle permanently in the United States or South America and be lost to the German nation entirely, and returning in raw material and in captive export markets considerably more to German industry than the empire's own administration cost the German treasury to maintain. And it is worth naming plainly that this promise was never once actually fulfilled across the whole of the German Colonial Empire's own 30-year existence. Every one of Germany's African and Pacific territories requiring, in nearly every year of its own colonial existence, direct subsidy from the German Imperial treasury to cover the cost of its own administration and its own military garrison. A subsidy that German colonial enthusiasts consistently justified through appeals to future profitability and national prestige rather than any concrete accounting of present returns, so that an empire built, at least in its own public justification, on the promise of paying for itself instead delivered, across the whole of its existence, a net financial drain on the very German taxpayers whose own national pride it had been sold to flatter. Consider, too, exactly which German financial institutions actually underwrote this same money-losing empire in practice, because major German banks, Deutsche Bank and the Diskonto-Gesellschaft chief among them, extended substantial credit to the railway and plantation ventures operating across German East Africa and German Southwest Africa alike, financing arrangements that let individual colonial enterprises turn a genuine private profit even in years when the colonial administration as a whole ran at a considerable public loss, a pattern that meant the empire's own financial burden fell overwhelmingly on the ordinary German taxpayer through direct treasury subsidy, while whatever profit the colonial economy did generate flowed disproportionately to the specific banks, trading houses and concession companies, Krupp among them for armaments and rail supply, that had the capital and the connections to actually participate in colonial finance at all, a distribution of cost and benefit that a considerable number of German critics, on both the political left and, on occasion, the more fiscally cautious right, pointed to as evidence that colonial policy served a narrow set of well-connected commercial interests considerably more directly than it ever served the ordinary German public whose own taxes were quietly making the whole arrangement possible. One further name belongs here too, that this same concentration of colonial profit among a comparatively small circle of German financiers and industrialists mirrored, in miniature, the same underlying inequality this whole long night has already traced across the empire's actual colonial subjects, a system in which the risks, financial and human alike, fell overwhelmingly on people, German taxpayers on one side of the ledger, an African, Pacific Islander, and Chinese labourers on the other, who had the least actual say in how the whole enterprise was run, while the concrete rewards, however modest in the aggregate national balance sheet, concentrated steadily upward toward the small number of institutions and individuals positioned to actually collect them. It is worth naming, too, exactly how Germany actually trained the officials it sent out to administer this entire scattered empire, because a dedicated colonial school, established at Witzenhausen in central Germany, specifically to prepare young German men for colonial administrative and agricultural careers, offered a curriculum that combined practical instruction in tropical agriculture and colonial law with a considerable dose of the same racial anthropology this evening has already described shaping German scientific thought more broadly. Students trained there absorbing, alongside genuinely useful technical knowledge, a formal academic framework for understanding the peoples they would go on to govern as belonging to a fixed and scientifically demonstrable racial hierarchy that placed Germans and Europeans generally at its own permanent summit. Notice too that graduates of this same school and of similar training programs a smaller number of German universities offered alongside it, went on to fill the ranks of colonial administration across every one of Germany's African and Pacific territories, meaning that the specific racial assumptions this evening is already traced through colonial law, through the 1905 marriage ban this evening is about to describe in Southwest Africa, through the Völkerschauen, and through the scientific collection of Herero and Nema remains, were not simply the informal prejudice of individual settlers acting on their own private assumptions, but a formally taught and formally credentialed body of knowledge that Germany's own universities and Germany's own dedicated colonial training institution actively produced, refined, and exported to every corner of the empire as a matter of genuine professional expertise. It is hard not to notice, finally, that a considerable number of the specific individuals who passed through this same colonial training pipeline, or through the parallel scientific institutions that supplied it with its own academic content, went on, once the empire itself had been stripped away entirely by the peace settlement, this evening's own later hours are about to describe, to continue their own academic and professional careers inside Germany itself, across the 1920s and 30s, carrying the same racial hierarchy they had once been trained to apply to Herero cattle herders and East African plantation labourers into a domestic German scientific and political establishment that would, within less than 2 decades of the colonial empire's own formal end, apply a considerably more elaborated and considerably more mechanised version of that very same hierarchy to European populations instead. Soldiers recruited from the very peoples their rifles were meant to help control. It is worth stating plainly the specific military institution that actually held this scattered empire together on the ground, because Germany, never possessing anywhere near the number of German-born soldiers or German colonial administrators that its own vast and scattered territorial claims would have required to garrison directly, depended in nearly every one of its African colonies on locally recruited colonial troops, formally organised into units called the Schutztruppe, the protection force, and staffed in their own enlisted ranks overwhelmingly by African soldiers, known most commonly by the term askari, recruited from ethnic groups German colonial administrators had come, through decades of practical experience, to regard as possessing a particular aptitude for military service, a designation that reflected considerably more about German colonial administrators' own racial theorising than about any genuine or consistent military tradition among the specific peoples so labelled. It is also worth noting exactly how these same askari troops actually served German colonial interests across the whole of the empire's existence, because it was askari soldiers rather than German regulars who provided the overwhelming majority of the actual fighting force German colonial administrators deployed to suppress the Herero and Nama uprising, the Abushiri revolt, and the Maji Maji rebellion this evening has already described in detail, meaning that the wars German colonial rule waged to suppress African resistance were themselves fought, in overwhelming numerical terms, by African soldiers recruited from other African communities and directed by their own German officers against fellow Africans resisting the very colonial system those same askari soldiers had chosen for reasons of pay, of status, or of straightforward economic necessity to serve. It is plain enough, finally, exactly how loyally a great many of these same askari soldiers went on to serve German colonial authority right through to the very end of German rule in Africa, a loyalty this evening's own next and final major section is about to demonstrate in considerable and genuinely striking detail. and it is worth naming honestly exactly how poorly that same loyalty was ultimately repaid, because German Askari veterans who had served with genuine distinction across decades of colonial military service found themselves, once German colonial rule in Africa ended entirely in the aftermath of the First World War, largely abandoned by the very government they had fought for, denied, in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, the military pensions German veterans of the same conflicts routinely received, and left, in a great many individual cases historians have traced through surviving colonial and post-war records, to press unsuccessful claims for recognition and compensation from a German government that had, almost overnight, lost both the colonies these soldiers had served in, and, very often, any practical interest in honouring debts owed to soldiers who were no longer German colonial subjects at all. It is worth pausing before this evening turns to the war that finally ended this whole empire. On a small handful of the individual, ordinary lives this whole story has so far mostly described only in aggregate, because an empire measured in square miles and casualty estimates can flatten, without meaning to, the specific and considerably smaller scale on which most of the people living inside it actually experienced their own lives. Consider an Askari soldier of the kind this evening has already described serving in the Schutztruppe across German East Africa, a young man recruited in a great many documented cases, not from any single ethnic group with a deep prior military tradition at all, but simply from communities where German recruiting officers had established a working relationship, drawn to enlistment by a wage, by the prestige a German uniform carried in his own community, or by the simple absence of any better alternative once the colonial hut tax had made subsistence, farming alone increasingly difficult to survive on, and who spent, in a great many recorded cases, a full military career of a decade or more moving between garrison postings scattered across a territory considerably larger than Germany itself, fighting, when called on to, against the very rebellions this evening has described among peoples not his own, and who found himself, by 1918, having served with genuine and sustained loyalty right through the whole of a remarkable campaign, this evening is about to describe in full, discharged into a colony that no longer existed under any German flag at all, and largely forgotten by the government he had spent his own adult life in uniform for. Consider too the considerably different but equally ordinary life of a German settler wife in southwest Africa, a woman who had, in a great many documented cases, emigrated from Germany specifically in response to colonial recruitment literature, promising cheap land and a fresh start, and who found herself, on arrival, running a household and frequently an entire farm's day-to-day operation on the isolated colonial frontier, while her own husband was away on militia duty or on extended trading trips, dependent for labour on exactly the same coerced African workforce this evening has already described, and recording, in the diaries and letters a considerable number of these same women left behind, and that historians have since used to reconstruct the texture of ordinary settler life, a mixture of genuine hardship, genuine isolation, and a casual, unexamined racial condescension toward the African workers whose own labour her household survival actually depended on, that reads, from the distance of a century, as one of the clearest and most unself-conscious windows available into how completely colonial racial hierarchy had become, for ordinary German settlers, simply the unremarkable furniture of daily life, rather than any conscious ideological position requiring justification at all. It is also worth naming, a considerably less remembered figure, a missionary of one of the several German Protestant and Catholic missionary societies operating across the empire, in East Africa or in Kamerun or in Southwest Africa alike, who typically spent decades of his or her own life, missionary work being one of the very few colonial occupations open to unmarried German women in any independent professional capacity at all, learning local languages with a fluency and a genuine personal investment that a great many colonial administrators, rotating through postings every few years, rarely bothered to match, running schools and clinics that provided to a limited number of African converts, some of the only formal education or medical care available anywhere in the colony, and living, in a great many documented cases, in a state of genuine private tension between a personal and often sincere affection for the specific communities their own mission served, and an institutional dependence on the same colonial government, whose own land policies and whose own labour demands were, at the very same moment, actively harming those same communities. A tension this evening has already shown you resolving itself in the specific case of the missionaries who watched the Herero genocide unfold and said little publicly against it, almost always in the government's own favour. It is impossible to miss, finally, that these 3 lives, an Askari soldier, a settler's wife, a missionary, moved through this same empire along completely separate tracks that rarely crossed in any meaningful way at all, and that this same separation, each group experiencing German colonial rule through an entirely different set of daily concerns and daily blind spots, is itself one further reason no single account, official or otherwise, was ever likely to capture the whole of what this empire actually was to the people who spent their own ordinary lives inside it. A ledger, briefly, in raw numbers alone. It is worth pausing before this evening turns to the war that finally ended this whole empire, to hold the plain arithmetic of it all in view at once, because the individual colonies this whole night has walked you through can, taken one at a time, obscure just how large the whole assembled structure actually was. At its own largest territorial extent, in the years immediately before the First World War, the German Colonial Empire covered something in the range of 1 million square miles of African and Pacific and Chinese territory, considerably larger than the home territory of Germany itself, and governed a combined population historians estimate at somewhere between 12 and 15 million people, the overwhelming majority of them in German East Africa and German Southwest Africa combined, a population administered across the whole of the empire by a German civil and military presence that never numbered, at any single point, much more than a few thousand German officials and a somewhat larger body of German colonial troops, meaning that the entire apparatus of German colonial rule rested, everywhere it actually reached, on a ratio of rulers to ruled running into the many hundreds to one. It is also worth noting that this same empire, across the whole of its 30-year existence, never once turned an aggregate profit for the German treasury, required continuous direct subsidy from German taxpayers to cover its own basic administrative and military costs, and produced, at its single most violent moment in Southwest Africa alone, a death toll running into the tens of thousands, a toll this evening has already shown you was very likely considerably higher still once the Maji-Maji famine in East Africa, this evening's own account of blackbirded Pacific labour, and the considerably less precisely documented mortality across Cameroon's concession territories are all added into the same reckoning, a combined human cost that no single official German document from the whole of the colonial period ever once attempted to add up in its own entirety. It is worth naming finally that this same empire lasted, from Lüderitz's own first disputed contract to the formal renunciation Article 119 imposed, almost exactly 35 years, a single human generation, built and lost within the working lifetime of men who were young adults when Vogelsang first stepped onto that empty stretch of southwest African coastline, and who were, by the time the Treaty of Versailles finally stripped the whole structure away, old enough to watch their own sons return from a war that had cost their nation, in the very same stroke, both the colonial empire this evening has spent tonight describing, and considerably more besides. A war that reached Togo within days, and a war that reached East Africa for 4 full years. It is worth turning now to the specific and genuinely rapid collapse this whole scattered colonial empire actually suffered once the wider European war it had spent 3 decades of naval bills and colonial rivalry quietly courting finally arrived in August of 1914, because nearly every one of Germany's overseas possessions, isolated from any realistic hope of reinforcement or resupply, once British and French naval forces asserted control of the sea lanes connecting them to Germany itself, fell to Allied attack within a matter of weeks, or, at the very most, months. Togo's own small garrison surrendering to a combined British and French force within less than 3 weeks of the war's opening. German Samoa surrendering without any resistance at all to a New Zealand expeditionary force that arrived within the war's own first month, and the Pacific Islands purchased from Spain in 1899 falling, across the closing months of 1914, to a rapid and largely unopposed Japanese naval occupation that would go on, in the peace settlement this evening is about to describe, to leave Japan holding, under a League of Nations mandate, nearly the whole of Germany's former Pacific Empire north of the equator. It is worth naming, too, that this same rapid collapse of Germany's actual overseas territories did not stop German war planners from continuing to dream, right through the middle years of the war itself, of an even larger African empire than the one already being lost, a scheme that came to be called Mittelafrika, Central Africa, under which German strategists in Berlin proposed that a victorious Germany, once the war in Europe had been won, would annex the Belgian Congo and the Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique outright, welding them together with whatever remained of Germany's own existing East and Southwest African territories into a single, contiguous colonial bloc, stretching unbroken from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, a vision German colonial enthusiasts and a number of senior German military planners continue to discuss in genuine earnest, well into 1917, at almost the exact same moment German forces were, in actual practice, being steadily driven out of the real colonies they already held. It is hard not to notice, finally, the specific and rather bitter irony this same scheme represents, because Mittelafrika was being drafted and debated in Berlin at almost precisely the moment Leto Vorbeck's own force, this evening's own next section is about to describe in full, was fighting a genuinely desperate rearguard campaign simply to remain an organised army at all inside the one German colony still holding out, a German war planning apparatus imagining a vastly expanded future African empire, even as the considerably smaller actual empire it already possessed was disappearing, province by province, in the field. Notice, too, exactly how much harder German Cameroon actually fought before it, too, finally fell, because the colony's own German and Askari defenders, considerably more numerous and considerably better organised than the garrisons of Togo or Samoa, waged a genuine and prolonged campaign against invading British, French and Belgian colonial forces, advancing from multiple directions across the whole of 1914 and 1915, holding out in the colony's own mountainous northern interior until the last organised German resistance finally surrendered in February of 1916, a campaign that cost the invading Allied forces considerably more in casualties and considerably more in time than the Empire's other African and Pacific possessions had required, but that ended in the final accounting in exactly the same result, the complete and permanent loss of German colonial authority over the territory. It is worth naming, plainly, exactly what made German East Africa's own defence so entirely different from every other colonial front of the whole war, because it was there, under the command of a German colonial officer named Paul von Leto Vorbeck, that German colonial resistance actually achieved something no other front of the First World War, in Europe or anywhere else, ever managed: an undefeated campaign that continued across the entire span of the war's 4 years, without the German commander ever once being decisively cornered, decisively defeated or forced into a formal surrender by enemy action at all. A general who understood, better than nearly anyone else fighting that same war, that an army too small to win could still refuse, indefinitely, to lose. Name this plainly, exactly what Leto Vorbeck actually understood about his own strategic position from the very outset of the war, because he recognised, with a clarity that a good many considerably better resourced commanders fighting on the war's European fronts conspicuously failed to match, that his own force, never numbering more than a few thousand German officers and a somewhat larger body of Askari soldiers, possessed no realistic prospect of actually defending German East Africa's own borders against the vastly larger British, South African, Belgian and Portuguese forces that would eventually be marshalled against him and that his own most valuable strategic contribution to the wider German war effort therefore lay not in holding any specific piece of East African territory at all, but in simply remaining an active, undefeated fighting force in the field for as long as humanly possible, tying down, through his own continued existence as a threat, a British and Allied military commitment of men, ships and supplies that ran, at various points across the war, to several times his own force's actual size, resources that might otherwise have been deployed against Germany on the considerably more decisive European front. It is also worth noting the specific and genuinely remarkable early victory that set the entire tone for the whole of Leto Vorbeck's campaign, because when a considerably larger British Indian expeditionary force landed at the East African port town of Tanga in November of 1914, confident of overwhelming the colony's own comparatively small garrison, in a single rapid assault, Leto Vorbeck's Askari defenders, fighting with a discipline and a local knowledge of the terrain that the invading force's own officers had badly underestimated, routed the considerably larger British landing force in a battle that came, in the wry and lasting nickname British veterans themselves attached to it, to be called the Battle of the Bees, after a documented incident in which disturbed wild beehives added a genuinely chaotic and genuinely painful complication to an already disintegrating British advance, a defeat that cost the British force casualties and captured equipment considerably out of proportion to the size of the garrison that had inflicted them, and that established, within the war's very first months, a reputation for Leto Vorbeck's own force that would go on to shape British strategic caution toward the East African campaign for the whole of the following 4 years. Consider, too, exactly how costly the fighting actually became once the Allied High Command, stung by the humiliation at Tanga, finally committed the considerably larger forces the campaign would go on to require, because a series of engagements across 1916 and into 1917, culminating in a particularly hard-fought battle at Mahiwa in October of 1917, inflicted casualties on the pursuing British and Allied forces that ran, in that single engagement alone, to several times the losses Leto Vorbeck's own considerably smaller force suffered in return. A battle that British commanders technically counted as a tactical victory, since Leto Vorbeck's own force withdrew from the field once its own ammunition began to run low, but that left the pursuing Allied commanders freshly and painfully reminded of exactly how expensive continuing to chase this same small German force through difficult and disease-ridden terrain was actually going to remain. One further name belongs here too, exactly what disease alone did to every army involved in this same campaign, considerably more than combat itself ever managed to, because malaria, dysentery, and a range of other tropical illnesses killed and incapacitated soldiers on both sides, at a rate that dwarfed battlefield casualties across the whole of the East African campaign. Leto Vorbeck's own force, forced by 1917 to abandon German East Africa's own borders entirely and continue its campaign inside Portuguese Mozambique, sustaining itself in considerable part by living off supplies, including boots, rifles and ammunition, captured directly from Portuguese colonial garrisons his own force overran along the way. A genuinely remarkable feat of improvised logistics for an army that had, by that point, been entirely cut off from any resupply from Germany itself for the better part of 3 years. Notice too the specific and rather striking way this same campaign finally came to its own conclusion, because Leto Vorbeck, having led his own force back across the border into northern Rhodesia in the final weeks of 1918, and having just captured the small British-administered town of Kasama in a final, almost anticlimactic engagement, received, only days later, formal notification from a British officer under a flag of truce that an armistice had been signed in Europe on the 11th of November, and that the war itself, in every other theatre on earth, had already ended. A piece of news Leto Vorbeck, by his own later account, received with genuine and considerable surprise, having had no reliable communication with Germany for months, and having had, by every practical military measure, every intention of continuing his own campaign indefinitely, for as long as his own dwindling force remained capable of moving and fighting at all. it is hard not to notice finally exactly what kind of homecoming awaited Leto Vorbeck once he actually returned to Germany. Because he arrived back in Berlin in March of 1919 to a hero's welcome considerably warmer than almost any other German commander of the entire war received. Parades and public honours celebrating the one German general who could genuinely claim never to have been defeated in the field, even as the empire he had spent 4 years so remarkably defending had, by the time he actually set foot on German soil again, already been formally and permanently signed away in the peace negotiations this evening's own next section is about to describe in full. It is plain enough finally exactly how long and exactly how far this same campaign actually continued once its own opening victory at Tanga had established the pattern, because Leto Vorbeck, steadily worn down across 1916 and 1917 by an accumulating British, South African, Belgian and Portuguese force that eventually numbered well over 100,000 troops, committed in total to hunting down a German force that itself never numbered more than a few thousand at any single point, responded not by standing to fight a decisive and, by that point, clearly unwinnable battle, but by leading his own steadily shrinking but remarkably resilient force in a long, mobile, deliberately evasive campaign that crossed, at various points across 1917 and 1918, the borders of German East Africa itself, Portuguese Mozambique and northern Rhodesia, living in considerable part off supplies captured directly from the very Allied forces pursuing him, a campaign of remarkable logistical improvisation and remarkable tactical patience that Leto Vorbeck sustained, in the end for the entire duration of the First World War, only finally agreeing to a formal surrender at the town of Abercorn in northern Rhodesia on the 25th of November 1918, a full 2 weeks after the armistice ending. The fighting in Europe had already been signed, and only once reliable confirmation of that same armistice and of Germany's own formal defeat finally reached him in the field, making his own force, by simple and undisputed historical fact, the very last organised German military unit anywhere on earth to lay down its arms in the whole of the First World War, undefeated in the field right up to the moment the war it had been fighting simply ceased to exist around it. A single sentence in a peace treaty that erased 3 decades of empire in one stroke. It is worth stating plainly exactly how completely and exactly how quickly the peace settlement that followed the armistice actually dismantled the whole of the colonial empire this evening has spent so many hours walking you through, because Article 119 of the Treaty of Versailles, negotiated among the victorious Allied powers in Paris across 1919 with no German representative permitted any meaningful voice in the actual drafting, required Germany to formally renounce, in favour of the Allied and associated powers, all of its rights and titles over its overseas possessions, a single clause that stripped, in one stroke of a pen wielded thousands of miles from any of the actual territories in question, an empire 3 decades and considerable violence in the building, transferring German Southwest Africa to South African administration, German East Africa, renamed Tanganyika, to British administration, with a smaller northwestern portion going to Belgium, Cameroon and Togo divided between British and French administration, and the whole of the Pacific Empire split between Japan, Australia and New Zealand, each new administering power holding its own former German territory, not as an outright colonial possession in the older 19th century sense, but under a new legal instrument, the peace settlement itself invented specifically for the purpose, a League of Nations mandate. It is also worth noting exactly what that same mandate system actually claimed to represent, because the League of Nations covenant establishing it described the arrangement, in language its own drafters presented as a genuine moral advance over the older colonial model, as a sacred trust of civilization under which the mandate powers were formally obligated to administer their newly acquired territories for the well-being and development of the peoples living there, preparing them, in principle, for an eventual self-government. The mandate's own founding language left deliberately vague as to timing, a formal legal framework that a great many of the mandate powers themselves examined honestly against their own actual administrative practices across the following 2 decades, continued to run in a manner considerably more consistent with ordinary colonial extraction than with any genuine and urgent preparation for African, Pacific or Chinese self-rule, so that the populations who had spent 3 decades under German colonial administration found themselves, almost without interruption, simply transferred to a new set of foreign administrators operating under a new and more flattering legal vocabulary, but pursuing, in the actual daily experience of the governed, remarkably similar practical policies. It is impossible to miss, finally, exactly what this same loss actually did to German political life across the following 2 decades, because the German public's own reaction to Article 119 folded into the wider and considerably more bitter German resentment of the whole Versailles settlement, produced a genuine and organised colonial revanchist movement, a Reich Colonial League that agitated throughout the whole of the Weimar Republic's existence for the eventual return of Germany's lost overseas territories, and that found, once the National Socialist government came to power in 1933, a regime that continued to voice, at least rhetorically, some interest in eventually reclaiming German colonial possessions, even as its own far more urgent and far more catastrophic territorial ambitions in Europe itself ultimately left colonial restoration a matter of secondary and, in the end, entirely unrealised priority, so that not 1 square mile of Germany's former overseas empire was ever actually returned to German administration at any point across the whole of the following century. It is worth naming plainly the specific individual who came to embody this whole colonial revanchist movement most completely once the National Socialist government took power, because Franz Ritter von Epp, a former colonial army officer who had served in the campaign suppressing the Herero and Nama uprising this evening, as already described in full, went on to become a senior Nazi Party official, serving as Reich Governor of Bavaria and, from 1933 onward, as president of the Reich Colonial League itself, a position in which he continued arguing, right through the 1930s, for the eventual restoration of Germany's African colonies specifically, a single career that carried a serving officer from the actual colonial genocide this whole night, has walked you through directly into the senior leadership of the regime that would go on to attempt a version of the very same logic, land cleared of its existing population for the benefit of a supposedly superior settler people on European soil instead. It is worth naming too the specific and considerably durable myth the same revanchist movement built and sustained across the whole of the Weimar period, a narrative German colonial veterans associations and sympathetic historians promoted under the label the colonial guilt lie, arguing directly against the very evidence this whole night has spent so many hours laying out, that Germany had in fact been a uniquely humane and uniquely well-organised colonial power. Its supposed excesses in southwest Africa and elsewhere are either grossly exaggerated by wartime Allied propaganda, or, when the underlying facts prove too well documented to simply deny, recast as isolated lapses considerably milder than the ordinary conduct of British, French or Belgian colonial rule, a narrative that found a receptive audience among a German public already primed by the wider and more general Weimar-era grievance against the whole of the Versailles settlement, to believe that Germany had been singled out for a punishment its own actual conduct did not really deserve. It is also worth noting that this same colonial revanchist current fed, in ways historians have traced with real care, into the language of living space that National Socialist ideology would go on to apply, with vastly greater and vastly more catastrophic ambition, to Eastern Europe rather than to Africa, German colonial planners of the 1910s and 20s having already developed, in their own writing about settling German farmers across the African territories this evening, as described, a vocabulary of agricultural settlement, racial hierarchy, and displacement of existing populations that later Nazi planners drawing up schemes for German settlement in occupied Poland and the occupied Soviet Union would borrow directly, adapting a colonial administrative logic first developed for Southwest Africa and East Africa to a European context its original authors had never actually anticipated. It is worth stating plainly, finally, that this same colonial guilt lie did not simply disappear once the Second World War discredited so much else of the ideological architecture it had fed into, surviving in a somewhat quieter and considerably less overtly nationalist form, well into the post-war West German historical memory, where colonial history remained for decades a genuinely marginal subject in German schools and German public discussion, compared to the intense and sustained national reckoning West Germany did eventually build around the Second World War, and the Holocaust specifically, a comparative silence around the colonial period that the historians this evening has already named, and the reparations negotiations this evening has already walked you through, have only in the last 2 or 3 decades begun to seriously and systematically break. Whose ledger this empire actually opened, and whose it left permanently closed. It is worth naming, plainly and without softening it, exactly how completely this entire scattered colonial project excluded, as a matter of formal German colonial law rather than mere informal practice, any genuine political voice for the millions of people who lived under it, because not a single African Pacific Islander or Chinese subject of any German colonial territory possessed, at any point across the whole of the empire's 30-year existence, a vote in any German legislative body, a formal legal path to German citizenship on equal terms with German settlers living in the very same territory, or any meaningful representation in the colonial administrations that governed their own daily lives. A legal exclusion German colonial law made explicit and, in Southwest Africa specifically, considerably more severe still, when the colonial legislature there formally banned marriage between German settlers and African women in 1905, a law that colonial administrators justified in the openly and explicitly racial language of preserving German racial purity, and that retroactively invalidated a number of existing mixed marriages German settlers had themselves previously entered into, stripping the African wives and mixed-race children of those same marriages of legal rights and legal recognition they had, until that same legislative act actually possessed. It is worth naming plainly the specific individual case that actually prompted German colonial authorities in Southwest Africa to draft that same 1905 marriage ban in the first place, because it grew directly out of a formal legal challenge brought by the mixed-race children of a settler whose own marriage to a Namer woman, and whose own children's claim to inherit German colonial citizenship rights, forced the colony's own legislative council to confront, in explicit and uncomfortable terms, exactly what legal status children of mixed African and German parentage were actually entitled to. A question the council resolved not by extending equal rights, but by moving swiftly to close off the whole category through outright prohibition, a decision that a small number of German colonial officials themselves criticised at the time as a genuinely harsh overreach, but that passed in the end with the near-unanimous support of the colony's own settler-dominated legislative body. Consider too exactly how differently this same colonial system treated African women more broadly, because the forced labour system this whole night has already described in East Africa and Cameroon alike fell on women in ways German colonial reports themselves, however unsympathetically, occasionally documented. Women conscripted to carry supplies and equipment for German military columns across considerable distances, a form of forced portage labour that colonial administrators justified as a practical necessity in territories that lacked roads and pack animals suitable for European-style transport, and that left a documented number of women dead from exhaustion and exposure on routes German officers recorded in their own official logs, with the same bureaucratic indifference this evening as already noted in the Southwest African camp mortality figures, alongside a pattern of sexual violence by German settlers and German colonial soldiers against African women that surviving colonial court records, missionary correspondence, and post-war oral testimony all independently confirm was widespread enough to trouble even a number of colonial administrators who were, by the standards of the era, otherwise entirely unmoved by the broader human cost of the colonial system they served. It is hard not to notice, finally, that African women organised their own forms of resistance to this same system in ways the official colonial record focused overwhelmingly on armed male combatants and male political leaders, has generally preserved far less completely than it deserves Herero and Nema women who survived the desert flight and the camps going on in the years immediately following the genocide to rebuild what family and community structures they still could under conditions of formal legal subordination and continued land dispossession, and women across German East Africa's plantation districts organising, in a considerable number of locally documented instances, informal work slowdowns and collective refusals of the most onerous portage and plantation labour demands. Quiet, sustained, and rarely individually named forms of resistance that this evening would ask you to hold, alongside the more dramatic armed uprisings, because they represent in their own way exactly the same refusal to simply accept colonial rule as given that Samuel Maharero's rebellion and Kinjekitile's blessed water represented on a larger and considerably more visible scale. Name this plainly, that this same legal inequality extended in formally codified terms to the basic question of what law actually applied to whom across every one of Germany's colonial territories, because German colonial administration operated everywhere in the empire under a formal dual legal system, one body of law drawing on ordinary German civil and criminal codes governing German settlers and German officials, and an entirely separate and considerably harsher body of so-called native law, applied to African, Pacific Islander and Chinese colonial subjects, and administered, in the overwhelming majority of cases, not by trained judges but by the same colonial officials who also served as tax collectors, labour recruiters and local administrators, a concentration of judicial, administrative and economic authority in a single official's hands that left colonial subjects with almost no independent recourse against abuse of any of those same three functions. Notice too that corporal punishment, the kiboko whip this evening as already described in East Africa specifically, was formally legal under this same native law framework across nearly every one of Germany's African colonies, a punishment German colonial law explicitly withheld from application to German settlers or German officials under any circumstances, reserving it, by simple and deliberate legal design, exclusively for the colonised population, a distinction German colonial jurists of the period defended in explicitly racial terms, arguing that African and Pacific peoples required a form of discipline more physical and more immediate than the ordinary legal procedures European subjects were entitled to. It is plain enough, finally, that this same dual legal structure did not disappear when German colonial rule itself ended, because the mandate administrations that took over Germany's former colonies after the First World War, this evening's own later hours are going to describe in full, generally retained rather than dismantled the basic native law framework German administrators had built, adjusting its specific provisions here and there but preserving, in nearly every one of the mandate territories, the same fundamental principle that colonised populations answered to a separate and considerably harsher body of law than their colonial rulers did, a continuity that meant the specific legal architecture of racial inequality. This whole night has traced through German colonial rule, outlived the German Empire itself by decades, inherited largely intact by the very powers who had gone to war, in part, on the rhetorical grounds of ending exactly this kind of colonial abuse. It is also worth noting exactly how completely the language German colonial administrators, German scientists and German popular culture used to describe the empire's own colonised subjects reflected, and in turn actively reinforced, a formal and increasingly rigid racial hierarchy. German intellectual life was, at almost exactly the same period, working to codify into something considerably more systematic and considerably more dangerous than casual colonial prejudice alone, because the same racial anthropology that had justified shipping Herero and Nama skulls back to German universities for study this evening has already described in full also shaped the design of the colonial exhibitions called Völkerschauen that toured German cities across these same decades, displaying African, Pacific, and occasionally Sami and indigenous American individuals in constructed village settings for the entertainment and, in the exhibition organisers' own explicit educational framing, the racial edification of paying German visitors, exhibitions that drew, in several documented cases, crowds numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and that shaped an entire generation of ordinary German civilians' understanding of the colonised peoples their own nation ruled through a lens of curiosity, condescension, and, in a great many recorded visitor accounts, outright racial contempt that German colonial policy in Africa and the Pacific had, for 3 decades, both produced and depended on in equal measure. It is impossible to miss, finally, exactly how directly a considerable number of historians have traced a line from this same colonial racial administration to the considerably larger and considerably more catastrophic racial violence Germany would go on to commit within Europe itself only a single generation later, because the specific administrative techniques German colonial officials pioneered in Southwest Africa, formal camp registration, systematic racial classification, and a documented willingness to frame the deliberate destruction of an entire population as a legitimate instrument of state policy, represent, to a great many serious historians examining the question, not a wholly separate and unrelated episode of colonial-era violence, but a genuine and traceable precedent, developed and refined on African soil against African victims, a full generation before European soil and European victims would suffer a version of the very same logic carried out on a considerably larger and considerably more mechanised scale, a continuity this evening would ask you to hold honestly rather than dismiss as mere historical coincidence, without ever suggesting that either atrocity requires the other to be fully and separately understood in its own right. Consider too exactly what happened within Germany itself to the small number of mixed-race children fathered by German colonial officials and German colonial soldiers, whether born in the colonies and later brought to Germany or, in a smaller number of cases, born to African women who had themselves come to Germany during the colonial period, and to a later and considerably more numerous group, children born in the 1920s in the German Rhineland to African soldiers serving with the French Army of Occupation there after the First World War, a group German nationalist propaganda labelled, in language of open and explicit racial contempt, the Rhineland bastards, because these two overlapping populations of mixed-race German-born children became, across the 1920s and into the 1930s, a specific target of exactly the racial science this evening has already traced back to the Herero and Nema genocide's own skull collection program. A small number of these same children, once the National Socialist government took power in 1933, forcibly sterilised under a secret 1937 program, historians have since confirmed targeted several hundred individuals specifically because of their mixed African and German parentage, carried out by medical commissions that drew, in a continuity, historians consider genuinely direct rather than merely suggestive, on exactly the same racial hygiene research the colonial period had helped establish as legitimate German science in the first place. It is worth stating plainly the specific individual scientist whose own career actually bridges this whole continuity most directly, because Eugen Fischer, a German anthropologist who travelled to Southwest Africa in 1908, specifically to study the mixed-race Rehoboth-Baster community, and to develop from that same study a formal scientific theory of racial degeneration through interbreeding, published his own findings in a book that became a genuinely foundational text of German racial hygiene, went on to direct Berlin's own Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity and Eugenics across the 1920s and 30s, and personally trained a generation of German physicians, including several who would go on to serve the Nazi regime's own forced sterilisation, and, later, its considerably larger programme of mass murder, in the specific racial science his own Southwest African fieldwork had helped originate, a single career that runs, in an almost unbroken and genuinely documented line, from a colonial research trip studying Herero and Nama survivors to the medical machinery of the Holocaust itself. Both hands held open at once on how this same empire actually compares to the colonial empires built by Germany's own rivals. It would be a genuine distortion, examined honestly, to tell this whole story as though German colonial rule was somehow uniquely brutal among the European empires of its own era, because the specific atrocities this evening has walked you through, the Herero and Nama genocide, the Maji famine, the concession company violence in Cameroon, sit alongside a considerably larger catalogue of comparable, and in several instances even larger colonial atrocities committed by Britain, France, Belgium and Portugal across these very same decades, King Leopold's own Congo Free State, this evening has already mentioned in passing, killing millions of Congolese through a forced rubber extraction regime that dwarfs, by simple scale, anything the considerably smaller German colonial economy in Cameroon ever managed to inflict, and British colonial policy in India producing famines, in Bengal in the 1870s, and again at the turn of the century, that killed populations numbering in the many millions through policies of grain export and administrative negligence. A great many historians now judge every bit as deliberate, in their own way, as anything this evening has described German administrators doing in East Africa. Notice too that German colonial rule was, in several specific and genuinely important respects, considerably shorter lived and considerably more thinly resourced than the British, French or Belgian empires it was competing against. 30 years from Bismarck's own reluctant first claims to the Versailles settlement stripping it all away again, compared to a British and French colonial presence across large parts of Africa and Asia that stretched in several territories well over a century, a difference in duration that means German colonial rule simply had less time, in absolute terms, to inflict the kind of accumulated harm a longer-lived empire might otherwise have managed. A genuinely important qualifying fact this evening would ask you to hold honestly rather than let the comparative brevity of German rule read, wrongly, as evidence of any comparative restraint or comparative mercy on Germany's own part. It is worth naming plainly, though, exactly why the Herero and Nama genocide specifically has come to occupy the particular and specific place it now holds in the broader history of European colonialism, a place considerably more prominent, in modern historical scholarship at least, than the raw comparative death toll alone might predict beside the Congo or Bengal, because the German campaign in Southwest Africa stands out not for its overall scale, which was smaller in absolute numbers than either of those two much larger catastrophes, but for the specific, documented, and formally issued nature of Trotha's own extermination order, a written command explicitly directing the destruction of an entire named people, rather than a policy of extraction or negligence that happened, as a secondary consequence, to produce mass death, a distinction in intent clearly stated and clearly preserved in the surviving written record that meets, in the judgment of a great many serious historians and legal scholars, the specific and considerably narrower modern legal definition of genocide in a way that the Congo Free State's horrific but somewhat differently structured atrocities and the British Bengal famine's own catastrophic but differently intentioned negligence do not quite as cleanly satisfy. It is hard not to notice, finally, that holding this same comparison honestly in both directions at once, neither minimising Germany's own specific crimes by pointing at its rivals' considerably larger ones, nor treating German colonial rule as some uniquely evil outlier, separate from the broader European colonial project that produced it, is exactly the kind of both-hands honesty this whole channel has tried, across every one of its own long nights, to offer you, because the truth, examined without flinching from either direction, is that the entire European colonial system that carved up Africa, Asia, and the Pacific across these same decades rested on the same underlying assumption, that the land, the labour and, when convenient, the lives of colonised peoples belonged to whichever European power got there first, and Germany, for all the particular horror of its own worst individual chapter, was one genuinely willing and genuinely enthusiastic participant in a considerably larger and considerably older imperial project. It did not invent and was never, in truth, unique in its own eagerness to join. How we actually know any of this, and whose voices the surviving archive was never built to properly hold. It is worth admitting honestly, exactly where the considerable body of evidence this whole night story is drawn on actually comes from, because the balance of that same evidence tilts, in ways worth naming plainly rather than simply absorbing without comment, heavily toward the perspective of the colonisers rather than the colonised, German colonial administrative records, German military reports, German missionary correspondence, and German settler memoirs surviving in state archives in Germany and in the former colonial territories alike, in a volume and a level of institutional preservation that the oral histories, the ordinary daily testimony, and the considerably more fragmentary written record left by Herero, Nama, East African, Cameroonian, Togolese, Pacific Islander, and Chinese communities themselves simply never received. An imbalance that means a great deal of what modern historians can say with real confidence about this empire's actual policies and actual death tolls comes, of practical necessity, from the very colonial administrators who had every institutional incentive to record their own actions in the most flattering and least incriminating light available to them. It's also worth noting exactly how historians and descendant communities alike have worked, across the past half-century in particular, to correct that same imbalance where it can still be corrected. Because Herero and Nama oral tradition, carefully collected and cross-referenced by both community historians and academic researchers in the decades since German rule ended, has preserved a memory of the 1904 genocide, individual family names, individual acts of survival, and individual acts of loss that the German Colonial Archive's own bureaucratic ledgers of camp populations and camp mortality, however useful, an accounting nobody at the time thought worth keeping, and the arithmetic historians have had to reconstruct since. It is worth pausing, honestly, on the specific and genuinely uncomfortable fact that no single, reliable, contemporaneously compiled tally of the total human cost of German colonial rule across all of its territories combined has ever existed, because the individual death tolls this evening has already given you the 60 to 80% of the Herero population and roughly half of the Nama population destroyed in southwest Africa, the 200,000 to 300,000 people who died of famine across the Meji rebellion's affected districts in East Africa, and the considerable but far less precisely documented mortality inflicted by blackbirded labour recruitment and introduced disease across the Pacific territories were each reconstructed decades after the fact by historians and demographers working backward from fragmentary German colonial census records, missionary correspondence, and surviving community memory, rather than from any single unified accounting German colonial administration itself ever bothered to keep, a silence in the official record that reflects with real honesty exactly how little the individual human lives lost across this whole empire actually registered, at the time, as a cost worth carefully tabulating at all. Notice too exactly how this same absence of careful contemporary accounting compares to the considerably more meticulous records German colonial and military administrations kept of their own losses across the very same conflicts, because German settler deaths in the opening days of the Herero uprising, German soldiers killed at Tanga and across the whole of Leto Vorbeck's campaign, and German colonial officials lost to disease or to combat anywhere across the empire were recorded, named, and in most cases individually commemorated with a precision and a permanence the vastly larger number of African, Pacific Islander and Chinese dead. This same empire produced were never afforded an asymmetry in whose deaths a colonial administration considered worth carefully counting that this evening would ask you to sit with directly, because it says, in its own quiet, bureaucratic way, every bit as much about the actual values underlying this whole colonial project as any single official proclamation or any single piece of colonial legislation ever did. It is also worth noting that even the individual death toll estimates this evening has given you across the whole of this empire, however carefully historians have reconstructed them from the fragmentary evidence available, carry a real and honestly acknowledged margin of uncertainty that the equivalent figures for German military and settler losses simply do not. A Herero population estimated at somewhere between 60 and 80,000 people before the 1904 uprising, and reduced by the most careful modern reconstructions to somewhere in the range of 15 to 20,000 survivors afterward, a range wide enough that reasonable historians working from the same underlying colonial census data have arrived at somewhat different specific totals, not because the scale of the destruction is genuinely in doubt. Every serious historian examining the evidence agrees it was catastrophic, but because the colonial administration that caused it never kept the kind of careful, individually verified population records for the Herero and Nama peoples that it kept, as a matter of routine bureaucratic practice, for its own German settlers and German soldiers, a final and perhaps the most quietly damning piece of evidence this whole night has offered you for exactly whose lives this empire's own paperwork was actually built to count, and whose it was never much interested in counting at all. Where the empire's own footprint still shows in a beer brand, a street name, and a century-old dispute over a word, it is worth naming, finally, and by way of bringing this whole long story back toward the present evening in which you are actually listening to it, exactly where traces of this vanished empire still surface in the world as it exists today. Because Tsingtao beer, this evening has already told you, remains one of the most widely sold Chinese beer brands on earth, its own recipe tracing directly back to the German brewers who founded it in 1903, a piece of colonial infrastructure considerably more commercially successful today, considered honestly, than the empire that originally built it ever managed to be in its own actual lifetime. Consider, too, that street names, church buildings, and administrative structures dating directly from the German colonial period remain visible today across cities including Windhoek in Namibia, Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and Qingdao in China, physical remnants of an empire whose formal political existence ended over a century ago, but whose built environment has, in a great many of these same places, simply been absorbed into the ordinary fabric of cities that continued growing long after the colonial administrators who first laid out their streets had gone home for good. It is worth naming, too, that a bronze memorial to the Askari soldiers who served and died fighting for German colonial rule once stood at the centre of Dar es Salaam, erected by German colonial authorities before the First World War specifically to honour African soldiers who had fought and died in German service, a monument British colonial administrators who took over the city afterward chose, notably, to leave standing rather than remove, and that the independent Tanzanian government has, in the decades since, continued to preserve, reinterpreting the same monument less as a tribute to German colonial loyalty than as a marker of African soldiers whose own considerable military skill and considerable sacrifice, whichever flag they fought under, deserve to be remembered on their own terms, a single physical object whose own meaning has shifted across 3 successive political eras without the bronze itself ever needing to change at all. It is also worth noting that Windhoek's own most prominent piece of German colonial statuary, an equestrian monument called the Reiterdenkmal, erected in 1912 to honour German soldiers killed suppressing the Herero and Nama uprising this evening, has already described in full, stood at the centre of the city for over a century before the Namibian government finally removed it from public display in 2013, relocating it to a considerably less prominent museum courtyard and replacing its own former plinth with a newly built Independence Memorial Museum, telling Namibia's own national history from the opposite direction entirely. A single monument's move from a city's central square to a museum storeroom standing in miniature for the whole of the slow and still unfinished work this evening has spent tonight describing, a nation renegotiating physically and not merely rhetorically, exactly whose memory its own public spaces are actually built to honour. Notice too that a very great deal of what this empire actually took rather than merely built also remains to this day, sitting in German institutions rather than in the communities it was originally taken from. German ethnographic museums having accumulated across the whole of the colonial period tens of thousands of African, Pacific and Chinese artifacts, religious objects, ceremonial regalia, and, this evening has already described in the specific and genuinely horrifying case of the Herero and Nama dead, actual human remains, a collection so large that Berlin's own Humboldt Forum Museum, opened to the public only in the past few years in a rebuilt replica of the old Prussian royal palace, has found itself at the centre of an increasingly public and increasingly difficult debate over exactly how much of its own collection should be returned to the specific communities it came from, a debate that has already produced a small number of formal restitutions. Additional Herero and Nama remains returned to Namibia in the years following the 2021 declaration, and a considerably larger number of individual artefacts and human remains still sitting, as this programme reaches you tonight, in German storage rooms and display cases, while the same slow, difficult negotiation over what genuinely counts as restitution, rather than merely a gesture, continues. It is also worth noting that the land dispossession this whole night has already traced back to Lüderitz's own contract, and to the decades of settler wrenching and rinderpest-driven debt that followed it remains in Namibia today, a live and largely unresolved political question, rather than a settled historical grievance, because a considerable share of Namibia's own commercial farmland remains, more than 3 decades after the country's independence, in the hands of descendants of German and other white settler families, a pattern the Namibian government's own official policy of willing seller, willing buyer land reform, under which the state purchases available farmland from willing sellers at market rates for redistribution, rather than pursuing any compulsory expropriation, has done comparatively little to actually change, land reform advocates within Namibia arguing, with real and mounting frustration, that a policy depending entirely on landowners' own voluntary willingness to sell was never likely to meaningfully redistribute land seized, in the first instance, through exactly the combination of mistranslated contracts, predatory credit, and outright genocidal violence this programme has spent tonight describing in full. It is hard not to notice, too, that the 2021 reconciliation agreement this evening has already left this same underlying land question almost entirely untouched. Its own negotiated funds directed toward infrastructure and development projects, rather than toward any direct programme of land restitution to specific Herero and Nama communities, a gap between historical acknowledgement and material redress that a great many Namibian land activists continue to name directly as the unfinished half of a reckoning Germany has, even now, only partially completed. It is worth naming too exactly how Herero and Nama communities in Namibia have chosen, in their own right and largely independent of whatever any German or Namibian government has or has not formally agreed to keep this same history alive in yearly public memory, because Herero communities across central Namibia gather every August at Okahanja for what has become known as Herero Day, a commemoration held at the graves of past Herero leaders, in which participants march in disciplined formation, wearing a distinctive red and white uniform deliberately modelled on the very colonial-era military dress the Schutztruppe once wore, a chosen and pointed inversion in which the descendants of a people German forces once tried to exterminate now wear a version of their exterminator's own uniform as an assertion of survival and continuity rather than defeat, a tradition that has continued every year, since long before any German government was willing to use the word genocide at all, and that will, in all likelihood, continue for a good while. Yet regardless of whatever further diplomatic language Berlin and Windhoek eventually settle on between them, it is impossible to miss, finally, that the specific dispute over language and legal categorization that has shadowed the whole of the German-Namibian reparations process this evening has already described development aid rather than reparations, regret rather than a fully accepted legal liability, echoes in a way this evening's own governing image would ask you to notice directly. The very first dispute this entire long story actually opened on. A single contested word in a single contract signed on an empty stretch of coastline in 1883. Because an empire that began with a mile that was not quite a mile, a document whose true meaning depended entirely on which side of the negotiating table you happened to be sitting on, has continued right down into the reparations, negotiations and restitution debates of the present decade to be defined and contested again and again by exactly this same gap between what one side's language technically states and what the other side actually understands or is actually owed, a gap this whole empire was built inside of from its very first contract, and that it has never, in the century and more since its own formal collapse, managed to fully close. Before this evening walks back through everything it has actually carried you across tonight, it is worth gathering together, in one place, some of the specific sounds and textures and smells this whole story has scattered across 4 continents, because an empire this large is easy to hold only as maps and casualty figures, and deserves, before it lets you go, to be remembered for a moment as a place people actually lived inside rather than merely a set of statistics. There is the particular dry, ringing silence of the Omaheki Desert at midday, a silence broken only by wind moving sand against itself, and, somewhere behind it, the specific and terrible absence of any water sound at all. There is the smell of raw sisal fibre drying in the sun along Tanga's own coastal plantations, a smell workers there still describe, sharp and green and slightly rotten all at once, alongside the specific rhythmic sound of the Kiboko landing that this evening has already asked you to hold in mind. There is the sound of German brass bands playing in the ballrooms of occupied Qingdao, even as, a few streets away, Chinese residents move through a city whose own street signs and whose own civic architecture had been built, deliberately, to make them feel like foreign guests inside their own home province. There is the taste of blessed river water and crushed millet on a Matumbi warrior's tongue, in the summer of 1905, a taste its own. Believers were certain would turn German bullets into nothing more than rain. There is the specific weight of a 50-pound supply pack on the back of a woman, conscripted for portage labour, somewhere along a German military column's own line of march, and the specific creak of ox-drawn wagons hauling German settlers and their few possessions ever further into land that had, only a few years earlier, still belonged to someone else's herd. Consider too the sound this whole story keeps circling back towards it without ever quite naming directly. Until now, the particular quality of somnolence that follows an order given and then obeyed without argument. There is a temptation, examined honestly, to tell this whole story as either a tale of villains or a tale of inevitable historical forces working themselves out, regardless of any individual's choices, and this evening has tried, across every hour of it, to resist both of those same temptations, because Bismarck did not want this empire, and built it, anyway, for reasons considerably more mundane than any grand imperial vision. Wilhelm II wanted it rather more than he ever fully understood what it would actually cost either his own colonial subjects or, in the end, his own nation, and the millions of Herero, Nema, East African, Cameroonian, Togolese, Pacific Islander, and Chinese people whose land, whose labour, and in an unforgivably literal sense whose very lives this empire consumed, never once chose any part of what was done to them at all. A story, in the end, considerably less like a single villain's deliberate design, and considerably more like the slow, grinding accumulation of individually defensible decisions. A merchant's contract here, an electoral calculation there, a general's field order somewhere else entirely, that together produced a scale of human suffering none of the individual men making any single one of those decisions ever fully intended or ever fully reckoned with at the time. And it is worth naming one final time that this whole night's story began and has kept returning to a single contested word, a mile that was not quite a mile, because empires, examined honestly, are very often built and unbuilt in exactly this way, not in the single dramatic clash a legend prefers to remember, but in the gap between what one party's language technically says and what the other party actually understands or is actually owed. A gap that ran from a merchant's contract on an empty coastline in 1883, through a chancellor's own carefully vague map of Africa, through a mandate system that called colonial rule a sacred trust of civilization, while changing remarkably little about its actual daily practice, all the way to a reparations agreement in 2021 still being argued over, in the plainest possible terms, as a dispute over which specific word, development or reparations, regret or liability, actually belongs on the page. Whatever is sitting on your own chest tonight, whatever worry followed you into this room, and is still waiting there quietly for you to notice it again, once this story finally lets you go, it is very likely smaller, considered honestly and side by side, than an empire that once stretched across 4 continents and has now been reduced, in the century since, to a handful of street names, a beer recipe, and a dispute over a single word still being argued over in negotiating rooms neither you nor I will ever sit in. Empires this large, and every single grief and every single fear folded inside of them, have come and gone before, and the world, however slowly and however imperfectly, keeps finding some way to keep turning underneath them regardless. That brings us to the end of our story for tonight. It is a story this channel told you honestly, without asking you to choose a single villain to blame it all on, and without letting the Empire's own more comfortable myths, the model colony, the sacred trust, the mere regrettable excess of an otherwise civilizing mission, stand in for what the surviving evidence actually shows. And it is a story, like every story this channel tells, that belongs now to whatever quiet, half-formed thoughts you carry with you into sleep tonight, because that is, in the end, the only place any of these old stories ever really finish. Thank you, as always, for spending these long, unhurried hours here with me tonight. If this kind of patient, wide-ranging history is the sort of thing you find yourself wanting more of, consider subscribing. And if you would like to help this small channel along its own way toward 10,000 subscribers, that would mean more than you probably realise. If you are watching this on YouTube, remember that the Spotify link for this channel sits waiting for you down in the description, since new episodes have taken to landing there a little ahead of this same screen these days. And if you are listening on Spotify right now, all it takes is searching Historian at Midnight on YouTube to find the rest of what this channel has quietly been building. Whatever this particular story leaves you thinking about tomorrow, a merchant's contract, a general's order, a soldier who never surrendered until the war around him had already ended, let it sit there, gently rather than urgently, because it has waited a century and more to be told properly, and it will keep for as long as you actually need it to. Close your eyes. If you have not already, let them fall shut somewhere in the last hour or two. Let the room around you go soft and unfocused and far away, and let whatever is left of tonight's long story settle, gently and without any further effort on your part, into wherever it is that stories go once we finally stop listening to them and simply let ourselves rest instead. Good night and sweet dreams.